Welcome, protector of dreams, to the complete chronicles of one who soared from tragedy into triumph, from shadow into light. Tonight, we trace the extraordinary journey of Richard John Grayson, whose path led from the circus heights to the darkest corners of Gotham City and beyond. Let the gentle rhythm of his story carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore how a young acrobat became the first Robin, then evolved into the hero known as Nightwing. Close your eyes, guardian of rest, and let these tales of growth, loss, and redemption unfold like the graceful arc of a trapeze through starlit skies. In the beginning, before the darkness claimed him, and before the cape became his second skin, there lived a boy whose laughter could fill the vast canvas tent of any circus in America, whose joy was as boundless as the sky beneath which he performed his impossible feats of grace and daring. This was Richard John Grayson, though the world would come to know him by many names, and his story begins not in the shadows of Gotham City, but in the bright lights and sawdust dreams of a traveling circus that carried magic from town to town, like seeds of wonder scattered on the wind. The child who would one day become the first Robin was born into a family where flight was not merely an occupation but a sacred art passed down through generations of Graysons who had learned to dance with gravity itself. Jack Grayson possessed the kind of natural athleticism that made seasoned acrobats weep with envy, his movements through the air so fluid and precise that audiences often forgot to breathe until he safely caught the bar or landed on the platform with arms raised in triumph. Mary Grayson was his perfect complement, a woman whose grace and timing had been honed through years of practice until she moved through space, as if she had been born with wings rather than arms. Together, Jack and Mary formed the heart of the Flying Graysons, an aerial act that had become the crown jewel of Haley's circus, drawing crowds from hundreds of miles away to witness performances that seemed to defy not only gravity, but the very limits of human possibility. Their love story had been written in the air 30 feet above ground, a romance conducted through perfectly timed catches, and trust so complete that each leap of faith was also a declaration of devotion that needed no words to be understood by anyone who witnessed their performances. When Richard was born, he entered a world that existed at the intersection of dreams and reality, where the impossible became routine, and where wonder was manufactured nightly for the delight of strangers who paid admission to forget their mundane troubles for a few precious hours. The circus was not merely his home, but his entire universe. A mobile community of performers and workers who treated every child as their own, and who understood that family was defined not by blood alone but by shared commitment to the ancient art of bringing joy to those who had forgotten how to find it for themselves. From his earliest memories, young Dick was surrounded by marvels that other children could only imagine, lions that responded to gentle words rather than whips, elephants whose intelligence sparkled in eyes older and wiser than those of most adults, clowns whose painted smiles concealed hearts full of genuine warmth and compassion for anyone who needed a laugh or a moment of silliness to lighten their burdens. The circus folk were his uncles and aunts, his grandparents and siblings, each one teaching him different lessons about life, performance, and the delicate balance between taking risks and staying safe. Yet it was in the air, suspended between earth and heaven, on platforms and bars that seemed impossibly fragile, that Dick truly came alive. By the age of 3, when most children were still mastering the art of walking without falling, he was already demonstrating an intuitive understanding of movement and balance that astounded even veteran performers who had spent decades perfecting their craft. His small hands seemed naturally designed to grip the trapeze bars, his body instinctively knowing how to position itself for optimal momentum and control. His parents began incorporating him into their act gradually, first allowing him to perform simple exercises on lower rigging while they handled the more dangerous aerial work above. The audiences loved him. This tiny figure in a miniature costume who moved with confidence that belonged to someone 3 times his age. His presence added a new dimension to the Flying Grayson's performances, transforming them from displays of athletic prowess into celebrations of family bonds and generational continuity that touched something deep and primal in everyone who watched. As the years passed and Dick's skills developed with remarkable speed, the Flying Graysons evolved from a duo into a trio, with each member contributing unique elements that made their combined performance greater than the sum of its individual parts. Jack provided the strength and power necessary for the most demanding catches and throws. Mary contributed the grace and precision that turned athletic achievement into artistic expression, and Dick brought an element of pure joy and fearlessness that reminded audiences why they had fallen in love with the circus in the first place. The training regimen that shaped Dick's development was unlike anything experienced by ordinary children, yet it never felt like work because it was conducted within the context of play and family bonding. Morning sessions began before dawn, when the air was cool and the circus grounds were quiet except for the sounds of animals waking and equipment being prepared for another day of travel or performance. Jack would guide his son through conditioning exercises, designed to build strength without adding bulk, flexibility routines that kept muscles loose and responsive, and endurance training that gradually extended the amount of time Dick could spend in the air without fatigue affecting his concentration. Mary's contributions to her son's education focused on the artistic and psychological aspects of performance, teaching him how to read audiences and adjust his energy to match their mood, how to use facial expressions and body language to tell stories that needed no words, and most importantly, how to maintain the kind of inner calm and focus that allowed performers to execute dangerous maneuvers while appearing completely relaxed and confident. She understood that the greatest acrobats were not merely athletes but storytellers who used their bodies as instruments of narrative and emotion. The technical skills that Dick mastered during these formative years went far beyond simple acrobatics to encompass a comprehensive understanding of physics, timing, and spatial relationships that would serve him well in contexts far removed from the circus ring. He learned to calculate trajectories and momentum with mathematical precision, to read the subtle signs that indicated when equipment was operating properly or beginning to show dangerous wear, and to maintain absolute awareness of his position relative to other performers, rigging, and safety nets at all times. Yet perhaps the most important lessons that Dick absorbed during his circus childhood were those that dealt with trust, responsibility, and the sacred bond that existed between performers who literally held each other's lives in their hands. The Flying Graysons act required split-second timing and absolute faith that each family member would be exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they had practiced countless times, with no margin for error or hesitation. A missed catch or poorly timed release could result not merely in injury but in death, making every performance an act of mutual devotion and shared courage. The circus taught Dick that excellence was not achieved through individual brilliance alone, but through harmonious cooperation with others who shared common goals and values. Every successful performance was the result of countless hours of practice, preparation, and communication, with each performer taking responsibility not only for their own safety and success, but for the welfare of their partners. This understanding of collective responsibility and mutual dependence would later prove invaluable when he found himself working with other heroes who relied on his skills and judgment in life or death situations. The nomadic lifestyle of the circus exposed young Dick to a diversity of people, places, and experiences that broadened his understanding of the world beyond what any stationary childhood could have provided. Each town brought new audiences with different expectations and energy levels, requiring the performers to adapt their acts and personalities to connect with people from vastly different backgrounds and walks of life. This constant exposure to variety taught Dick to be flexible and observant, to read social cues quickly and accurately, and to find common ground with anyone willing to open their hearts to wonder and joy. The economic realities of circus life also provided Dick with lessons about resourcefulness, frugality, and the importance of taking care of equipment and fellow performers. Money was often tight, with the entire operation dependent on ticket sales and concession revenue that could fluctuate dramatically based on weather, local economic conditions, and competition from other forms of entertainment. Everyone in the circus community understood that waste and carelessness were luxuries they could not afford, that every piece of equipment had to be maintained and repaired rather than replaced, and that looking out for one another was not merely a moral obligation, but a practical necessity for survival. The animals in Haley's circus were not mere attractions but integral members of the community, each one cared for with the same attention and affection that human performers showed to their own family members. Dick learned to approach elephants with respect for their intelligence and emotional complexity, to work with lions and tigers as partners rather than adversaries, and to recognize that even the smallest creatures deserved gentle treatment and proper care. This early exposure to animal welfare would later influence his approach to all living beings, fostering the compassion and respect for life that would define his heroic career. As Dick approached his 12th birthday, the Flying Graysons had reached the pinnacle of their profession, earning recognition as perhaps the finest aerial act in the world. Their performances combined technical mastery with artistic vision, creating experiences that transcended mere entertainment to become transcendent moments of beauty and human achievement. Audiences left their shows feeling inspired and uplifted, carrying with them memories of grace and courage that would sustain them through whatever challenges awaited in their ordinary lives. The invitation to perform at Gotham City represented the culmination of years of hard work and artistic development, offering the Flying Graysons an opportunity to showcase their talents before some of the most sophisticated and demanding audiences in the country. Gotham's reputation as a city that appreciated excellence in all its forms made this engagement particularly meaningful, a chance to cement their legacy as performers worthy of the highest acclaim and recognition. Yet, beneath the excitement and anticipation that surrounded their Gotham City engagement, lay currents of tension and danger that would soon shatter the innocent world in which Dick had spent his entire life. The city's reputation for sophistication was matched by its notoriety for corruption and violence, with criminal organizations operating in the shadows cast by its towering buildings and legitimate businesses. The same wealth and culture that made Gotham an attractive venue for performers also made it a target for those who preferred to take rather than earn, who saw success and happiness as resources to be exploited rather than achievements to be celebrated. Tony Zuko represented everything dark and predatory about Gotham's criminal underworld, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his complete indifference to the suffering he caused in pursuit of personal profit. His extortion racket targeted businesses that could least afford to pay protection money, using threats and violence to terrorize honest people into surrendering portions of their hard-earned income to avoid even worse consequences. The circus, with its combination of valuable equipment, vulnerable performers, and dependence on public goodwill, presented an ideal target for his particular form of sophisticated thuggery. The conversation that Dick overheard between Zuko and the circus management was conducted in low, urgent tones that immediately caught his attention, despite his youth and supposed innocence about adult matters. His natural curiosity and the acoustic properties of the big top allowed him to understand far more of the exchange than anyone realized, giving him knowledge that no child should possess about the threats facing his family and the broader circus community. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on his young shoulders like a physical burden, creating an internal conflict between his desire to protect those he loved and his uncertainty about how a 12-year-old boy could possibly make a difference against adult criminals. The specific demands that Zuko made were both simple and impossible for the circus management to meet without destroying their ability to operate profitably. The protection money he demanded represented a significant percentage of their nightly revenue, money that was already earmarked for equipment maintenance, performer salaries, animal care, and the countless other expenses necessary to keep a traveling circus functioning. Paying Zuko would mean cutting corners in areas where corners could not be cut without endangering lives and compromising the quality of performances that audiences expected and deserved. The circus management's refusal to submit to Zuko's demands was based not merely on financial considerations, but on principles that went to the heart of what the circus represented. These were people who had dedicated their lives to bringing joy and wonder to others, who had chosen to preserve and continue traditions of performance and artistry that stretched back for generations. Surrendering to criminal extortion would have been a betrayal not only of their own values but of every performer who had ever risked their life to maintain the circus as a place where beauty and courage could flourish despite the darkness of the world outside. Dick's internal struggle over whether to warn his parents about the threats he had overheard reflected the collision between his child's understanding of family loyalty and his growing awareness of adult complexities that defied simple solutions. He knew that telling his parents would cause them worry and distress, possibly leading them to make decisions based on fear rather than their usual confidence and optimism. Yet keeping silent felt like a betrayal of the trust and openness that had always defined their family relationships, a violation of the honesty and communication that had made their aerial performances possible. The decision to remain silent was not made from cowardice, but from a child's flawed understanding of how adults made decisions and handled threats. Dick believed that his parents were invincible, that their skill and experience would protect them from any danger, that somehow their goodness and dedication to bringing joy to others would shield them from the evil that men like Zuko represented. His faith in their abilities was absolute and touching, yet it was also tragically misplaced in a situation where skill and goodness were no match for calculated malice and mechanical sabotage. The night of the fatal performance began like countless others, with the familiar rituals of preparation, costume checks, and final technical reviews that had become as natural and comforting as breathing. The atmosphere backstage was charged with the usual mixture of excitement and nervous energy that preceded every show, performers going through their individual routines for maintaining focus and managing pre-show anxiety. Dick felt the same anticipation he always experienced before flying, the pleasant tension that sharpened his senses and prepared his body for the physical and mental demands of performance. The rigging had been inspected according to standard protocols, with experienced crew members checking every cable, connection, and mechanical component that would support the performers during their aerial work. The trapeze bars were examined for cracks or wear, the safety nets were positioned and tested for proper tension, and the platforms were secured and verified as stable. Every precaution that reasonable people could take had been taken, yet the sabotage that Zuko's men had accomplished was so subtle and precisely targeted that it would not become apparent until the exact moment when failure would prove most catastrophic. As the flying Graysons took their positions for the opening sequence of their act, the audience below represented a cross-section of Gotham society, from working families who had saved for weeks to afford tickets to wealthy socialites who attended the circus as much to be seen as to see. Among them sat Bruce Wayne, a young man whose own life had been shaped by tragedy and loss, though he could not have imagined that he was about to witness events that would create another orphan whose path would intertwine with his own. in ways that would define both their destinies. The first portions of the Flying Grayson's performance unfolded with their usual precision and artistry, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, as the family created patterns of beauty and daring that held the audience in rapt attention. Dick moved through his portions of the routine with the unconscious grace of someone for whom flight had become as natural as walking, his young body responding to the familiar rhythms and timing that had been ingrained through years of practice and performance. The moment of catastrophic failure arrived without warning or ceremony, a mechanical malfunction so sudden and complete that there was no possibility of recovery or alternative action. The sabotaged rigging gave way at precisely the moment when Jack and Mary were furthest from any platform or safety device, their bodies already committed to aerial maneuvers that required perfect timing and support from equipment that was no longer capable of providing either. The sound of breaking cables and shifting hardware was lost in the general noise of the performance, noticed too late by anyone who might have been able to intervene. The fall itself seemed to occur in slow motion from Dick's perspective, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing as the two people who meant everything to him plummeted toward the sawdust ring far below. Time stretched and distorted as he watched his parents' desperate attempts to find handholds or create some means of breaking their fall, their acrobats' instincts fighting against physics and mechanical failure until the very end. The impact, when it came, was final and irrevocable, transforming the center ring from a place of joy and wonder into a scene of tragedy and loss that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the remainder of their lives. The silence that followed the crash was profound and terrible, a void that seemed to swallow not only sound but hope itself as the reality of what had occurred slowly penetrated the consciousness of performers and audience members alike. Dick's scream, when it finally came, was a sound that contained all the anguish and disbelief that a 12-year-old mind could hold, a cry that seemed to echo through the big top long after his voice had given out. The circus that had been his entire world, the source of all his joy and security, had become in an instant a place of horror and devastating loss. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy unfolded in a blur of activity and confusion as emergency personnel arrived to confirm what everyone already knew, that Jack and Mary Grayson had died instantly from injuries that no medical intervention could have prevented. The other circus performers moved through their shock and grief to comfort Dick and each other. Yet their own loss was so profound that they struggled to find words or actions adequate to the situation. The Flying Graysons had been more than performers. They had been the heart and soul of the circus community, the embodiment of everything noble and inspiring about their chosen way of life. Among the crowd of shocked and grieving spectators, Bruce Wayne recognized something in the young boy's anguish that resonated with memories of his own childhood trauma, the night when he had watched his own parents die and felt the same crushing sense of loss and abandonment that now overwhelmed Dick Grayson. The connection was immediate and profound, though neither of them could have articulated the forces that were drawing them together, or the significance of this moment of shared recognition across the boundaries of age, wealth, and circumstance. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal evidence of sabotage, though the full extent of Zuko's involvement would not be discovered until much later. The immediate focus was on caring for the surviving members of the circus community and determining what would happen to a 12-year-old boy who had lost not only his parents but his entire way of life in a single terrible evening. The circus had been his home, his family, his identity, and his future, yet without his parents, his place in that world was no longer certain or sustainable. Dick's internal struggle with guilt and self-recrimination began immediately, his child's mind fixating on the conversation he had overheard, and his decision not to warn his parents about the threats against the circus. The knowledge that he might have been able to prevent their deaths if he had acted differently became a weight that threatened to crush his spirit, transforming his grief into something more complex and corrosive that would require years of healing and understanding to resolve. The boy who had always been surrounded by love and support now faced the future alone, carrying burdens that no child should have to bear. Yet, even in the depths of his despair, Dick Grayson possessed qualities that would eventually enable him not merely to survive his loss, but to transform it into a source of strength and purpose that would benefit countless others. The courage that had carried him through aerial performances would sustain him through the darker challenges ahead, while the love and values that his parents had instilled would provide the foundation for a heroic career that would honor their memory in ways that 12-year-old Dick could never have imagined. The boy who fell from the trapeze that night would eventually learn to fly again, though his wings would be fashioned from very different materials than those his parents had used to soar above the circus ring. The transition from circus orphan to ward of one of Gotham's most prominent citizens unfolded with a gentleness that belied the profound changes occurring in every aspect of Dick Grayson's existence. Yet beneath the surface, kindness and material comfort lay psychological depths that would require years of careful navigation before the boy could find solid ground upon which to build a new identity. Bruce Wayne's decision to take responsibility for the traumatized child was motivated by impulses he could not entirely explain even to himself, though those who knew him best recognized the unmistakable signs of someone seeking redemption through service to another who had suffered similar losses. Wayne Manor represented a universe entirely alien to anything Dick had previously experienced, its vast rooms and formal grandeur creating an atmosphere that seemed designed more for intimidation than comfort. Yet within these imposing walls lived a man whose own childhood trauma had left him uniquely qualified to understand the specific nature of the grief and confusion that now consumed his young ward. The mansion's countless rooms and hidden passages would eventually become as familiar to Dick as the rigging and platforms of the circus had once been, though the process of adaptation required him to develop entirely new forms of spatial awareness and social navigation. Alfred Pennyworth's role in Dick's adjustment to his new circumstances proved crucial in ways that went far beyond the formal duties of household management, for the butler possessed an intuitive understanding of how to provide stability and routine for a child whose entire world had been shattered by violence and loss. His gentle guidance helped Dick navigate the bewildering array of social expectations and behavioral norms that governed life among Gotham's elite, while his genuine warmth and interest provided the kind of consistent emotional support that enabled healing to begin despite the magnitude of the losses that had brought the boy to Wayne Manor. The initial weeks of Dick's residency were marked by a careful dance of mutual assessment, as Bruce sought to understand the full extent of his ward's capabilities and psychological needs, while Dick struggled to make sense of his benefactor's motivations and the strange new reality in which he found himself. The wealthy playboy persona that Bruce maintained in public bore little resemblance to the intense, driven individual who emerged in private conversations, creating a sense of mystery and complexity that intrigued Dick even as it sometimes frustrated his attempts to understand exactly who had become his guardian and what role he was expected to play in return. The grief counseling that Bruce arranged for Dick was conducted by professionals who specialized in childhood trauma, yet their clinical approaches proved inadequate to address the specific combination of survivor guilt, identity displacement, and existential confusion that characterized his particular form of bereavement. The loss of his parents was compounded by the simultaneous destruction of his entire way of life, leaving him without not only family but community, purpose, and the physical activities that had defined his sense of self since earliest memory. Traditional therapeutic interventions seemed pale and insufficient, when measured against the magnitude of these interwoven losses. More effective than formal counseling were the long conversations that developed naturally between Bruce and Dick during quiet evening hours in the Manor's library or study, discussions that ranged across topics as diverse as literature, philosophy, science, and human nature, while gradually creating opportunities for both participants to share experiences and insights that formal therapy might never have accessed. Bruce's intellectual curiosity and broad knowledge base provided Dick with mental stimulation that helped distract from his grief, while also introducing him to ways of thinking about the world that went far beyond anything he had encountered in his circus education. The discovery of Dick's exceptional intellectual abilities occurred gradually through these informal educational interactions, as Bruce began to realize that his ward possessed not merely the quick reflexes and physical coordination that had made him an outstanding acrobat, but also an analytical mind, capable of processing complex information with remarkable speed and accuracy. The boy's questions revealed a natural detective instinct that operated through intuitive leaps and pattern recognition, suggesting cognitive capabilities that could be developed into genuinely formidable investigative skills if properly trained and focused. Physical conditioning became another avenue through which Bruce could provide Dick with constructive outlets for his energy, while also beginning the subtle process of evaluation that would eventually determine whether the boy possessed the qualities necessary for the dangerous work that the billionaire pursued after dark. The gymnasium that Bruce had installed in Wayne Manor's lower levels contained equipment sophisticated enough to challenge even elite athletes. Yet Dick adapted to these new training modalities with the same natural grace that had made him a star performer in the circus ring. The martial arts instruction that formed the core of Dick's physical education represented a fundamental shift from the purely aesthetic and performance-oriented movements that had defined his circus training to combat techniques designed for practical application in life or death situations. Bruce's own mastery of multiple fighting disciplines provided him with the knowledge base necessary to design training programs that built upon Dick's existing strengths, while addressing the specific gaps in his preparation that would need to be filled before he could safely engage in vigilante activities. The psychological dimensions of this combat training proved as important as the physical techniques being learned, for Bruce understood that effective fighting required not only technical skill, but also the mental conditioning necessary to remain calm and focused under extreme pressure. The meditation and breathing exercises that complemented the martial arts instruction helped Dick develop the kind of emotional regulation that would prove essential for someone whose future work would involve constant exposure to violence, danger, and moral complexity. Detective work represented the intellectual counterpart to physical training, as Bruce began introducing Dick to the methodologies of observation, deduction, and evidence analysis that formed the foundation of his investigative approach to crime fighting. The boy's natural curiosity and pattern recognition abilities made him an apt pupil for lessons in forensic science, criminal psychology, and the countless technical skills that modern detective work required, from computer systems and surveillance technology to the more traditional arts of disguise, infiltration, and information gathering. The gradual revelation of Bruce's secret identity occurred through a series of carefully orchestrated discoveries rather than a single dramatic moment of disclosure, as the older man tested his ward's readiness to handle the truth about his guardian's nocturnal activities, while also assessing whether Dick possessed the character traits necessary to become a trusted partner, rather than merely an informed bystander. The boy's reactions to each partial revelation provided Bruce with crucial information about his psychological resilience and moral development. The night when Dick finally learned that Bruce Wayne and Batman were the same person represented a watershed moment in both their lives. transforming their relationship from one of guardian and ward into something approaching a partnership between individuals united by shared commitment to justice and mutual understanding of how personal tragedy could be transformed into purposeful action. The revelation occurred in the Batcave itself, that vast underground complex that served as both sanctuary and command center for Gotham's most effective crime fighter. The Batcave's impact on Dick's imagination and sense of possibility was immediate and profound, for here was tangible proof that one individual with sufficient resources, determination, and skill could create the infrastructure necessary to wage effective war against crime and corruption on a citywide scale. The cave's combination of advanced technology and symbolic power spoke to aspects of Dick's personality that had been dormant since his parents' death, reawakening his sense of wonder and possibility, while also providing him with concrete evidence that heroism was not merely a fantasy, but an achievable goal for those willing to pay the necessary prices. The investigation into his parents' murder took on new urgency and effectiveness once Dick gained access to Batman's resources and methodologies, though the emotional weight of pursuing this particular case created psychological challenges that went beyond the technical demands of detective work. The need to maintain objectivity while investigating the deaths of loved ones required a form of compartmentalization that tested Dick's emotional maturity, yet the pursuit of justice for Jack and Mary Grayson also provided him with a sense of purpose that helped transform his grief into motivation for constructive action. The discovery of Tony Zuko's responsibility for the sabotage that had killed Dick's parents brought with it a complex mixture of vindication and frustration, as the evidence clearly established the mob enforcer's guilt while also revealing that traditional law enforcement methods had proven inadequate to bring him to justice. The corruption that had allowed Zuko to operate with impunity for years demonstrated the systemic failures that made vigilante intervention necessary. Yet, it also highlighted the moral complexities that would define Dick's future career as someone who operated outside legal frameworks in pursuit of justice that the system could not or would not provide. Zuko's death from a heart attack before he could be arrested or tried represented a form of cosmic justice that satisfied neither Bruce nor Dick, leaving them with the uncomfortable realization that some forms of closure were simply not available to those who sought resolution through proper channels. The anticlimactic nature of the mob enforcer's demise served as an early lesson about the unsatisfying nature of real-world justice, which rarely provided the clear-cut resolutions that fiction suggested were possible or appropriate. The offer that Bruce extended to Dick following the resolution of his parents' murder case was presented not as charity or sympathy, but as recognition of capabilities and character traits that qualified the boy for partnership in work that required the highest levels of skill, commitment, and moral certainty. The invitation to become Robin represented both honor and burden, offering Dick the opportunity to transform his personal losses into a force for protecting others, while also committing him to a dangerous path that would demand sacrifices and compromises that no 12-year-old could fully anticipate or understand. The name Robin carried with it layers of meaning that spoke to Dick's emotional needs and psychological development, honoring the nickname that his mother had given him, while also establishing his independence from Bruce's Batman identity. The choice represented a form of self-determination that allowed Dick to maintain connection to his family heritage, while also embracing a new role that would enable him to channel his grief and anger into constructive action on behalf of others who faced similar threats and losses. The costume design process revealed Bruce's understanding of the psychological importance of symbols and visual representation in crime fighting, as well as his recognition that Dick's effectiveness would depend partly on his comfort with his new identity and role. The incorporation of elements from the Flying Grayson's performance costumes ensured that Robin's appearance would honor Dick's circus heritage while also serving the practical requirements of vigilante work, from freedom of movement to protection from injury and environmental hazards. The 6 months of intensive training that followed Dick's acceptance of the Robin mantle represented a compressed course of instruction that covered everything from advanced combat techniques to the psychological preparation necessary for confronting human evil on a regular basis. Bruce's teaching methods combined formal instruction with practical exercises designed to test Dick's capabilities under pressure, while also building the kind of trust and communication patterns that would prove essential when they began working together in life-threatening situations. The technical aspects of this training encompass not only fighting skills, but also the countless specialized knowledge areas that effective crime fighting required, from lock-picking and safe cracking to computer programming and electronic surveillance. Dick's natural intelligence and physical coordination allowed him to master these diverse skills with remarkable speed, though Bruce was careful to ensure that technical proficiency was balanced with the moral and ethical education that would prevent these capabilities from being misused or applied without proper consideration of consequences. The psychological preparation for vigilante work proved more challenging than the technical training, requiring Dick to develop the mental resilience necessary to witness human suffering and evil without becoming overwhelmed by despair or consumed by the desire for revenge. Bruce's own struggles with these psychological challenges provided him with insights into the specific forms of preparation and support that would help Dick navigate the moral complexities of their chosen work while maintaining his pro-complexities of their chosen work, essential humanity and compassion. The final test that Bruce designed to evaluate Dick's readiness for active duty represented a comprehensive assessment of everything the boy had learned during his months of preparation, combining elements of stealth, detection, combat, and moral decision-making in a scenario that simulated the kinds of complex challenges they would face together on the streets of Gotham. The requirement that Dick evade Batman himself for an entire night, while also accomplishing specific objectives, tested not only his technical skills, but also his ability to think strategically and maintain focus under extreme pressure. The success of this final examination exceeded even Bruce's optimistic expectations, as Dick demonstrated not only mastery of the skills he had been taught, but also the kind of creative problem-solving and intuitive understanding that could not be learned through instruction alone. His capture of a genuine criminal during the course of his test provided dramatic proof that he was ready to begin contributing meaningfully to their war against crime, rather than merely observing and learning from the sidelines. The first night that Dick Grayson took to the streets of Gotham City as Robin, the Boy Wonder, marked the beginning of a partnership that would redefine both participants, while also establishing new possibilities for what heroism could accomplish when it operated through collaboration rather than isolation. The boy who had fallen from the circus trapeze had learned to fly again, though his new form of flight would carry him through very different skies than those his parents had navigated with such grace and beauty. The transformation from grieving orphan to confident crime fighter represented more than mere training or education. It was a fundamental reimagining of identity and purpose that honored the past while embracing a future filled with both danger and the promise of making a meaningful difference in the lives of those who could not protect themselves from the darkness that lurked in every city's shadows. The partnership that bloomed between Batman and Robin during those early months of their collaboration represented more than the simple addition of a junior member to Gotham's vigilante activities. It was the birth of something entirely new in the realm of crime fighting, a dynamic that transformed both participants while establishing precedents and possibilities that would echo through generations of heroes who would follow in their footsteps. The The boy who had once soared through circus tents now found himself navigating the vertical landscape of Gotham's skyline, his acrobatic skills translating seamlessly to an urban environment where buildings became platforms and gargoyles served as anchor points for swinging between the towering monuments to human ambition and corruption. The early cases that Batman and Robin tackled together served as both training exercises and genuine contributions to the safety of Gotham citizens, with each successful mission building Dick's confidence while also teaching him the practical realities of detective work that no amount of theoretical instruction could convey. The Penguin's elaborate schemes involving trained birds and umbrella-based weaponry provided the new partnership with opportunities to test their coordination and communication under fire, while encounters with the Riddler's puzzle-based crimes challenged Dick's analytical abilities and demonstrated how intellectual curiosity could be weaponized by minds that had chosen darkness over enlightenment. The dynamic between the Dark Knight and the Boy Wonder evolved rapidly from one of teacher and student to something approaching true partnership, though Bruce maintained ultimate authority and responsibility for their shared activities. Dick's natural leadership instincts, honed through years of being the focal point of circus performances, began to emerge as he gained experience and confidence in his new role. His suggestions and insights proved valuable enough that Bruce learned to actively seek his input rather than simply directing his actions, creating a collaborative approach that made both of them more effective than either could have been working alone. The psychological benefits that Dick derived from his crime-fighting activities went far beyond the satisfaction of pursuing justice or the excitement of physical challenges. The work provided him with a sense of purpose that helped process his grief, while also connecting him to something larger than his personal losses and concerns. Each person they saved and each criminal they stopped represented a small victory against the forces of chaos and cruelty that had claimed his parents, transforming his pain into a tool for protecting others from similar tragedies. Yet as Dick's skills and confidence grew, so did his awareness of the broader community of young heroes who were beginning to emerge across the country, individuals, his own age, who possessed extraordinary abilities or had been touched by circumstances that led them toward heroic careers. The stories that filtered through Batman's extensive information networks spoke of an Amazon princess who had left her island home to serve in the world of mortals, a young speedster who had inherited incredible velocity from cosmic accident, an Atlantean prince learning to navigate the surface world, and an archer's protege mastering weapons that could match any modern technology for precision and effectiveness. The first meeting between Dick Grayson and these other young heroes occurred through circumstances that none of them could have predicted or planned, though the bonds that formed during that initial encounter would prove strong enough to sustain a partnership that would endure for years, despite the geographic distances and different responsibilities that separated them in their individual heroic careers. Donna Troy's strength and warrior training complemented Dick's agility and tactical thinking, while Wally West's super speed provided the team with capabilities that could turn the tide in situations that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. Garth's connection to the underwater realms opened entirely new dimensions of adventure and responsibility for the young heroes, introducing them to threats and challenges that existed beyond the terrestrial concerns that had previously defined their individual missions. Roy Harper's archery skills and street-smart attitude provided a grounding influence that balanced the more exotic abilities of his teammates, while his experience working with Green Arrow gave him insights into the complexities of superhero partnerships that proved valuable as the group learned to function as a cohesive unit. The formation of the Teen Titans represented Dick's first opportunity to exercise the leadership abilities that had been developing since his circus days. Though the challenges of coordinating a team of peers with diverse backgrounds and capabilities proved far more complex than anything he had previously encountered. Unlike his partnership with Batman, where clear hierarchies and established protocols governed their interactions, the Titans required him to build consensus and maintain group cohesion through persuasion and example rather than authority and experience. The name Teen Titans reflected both the youth of its members and their determination to prove that age was no barrier to effective heroism, though the choice also created expectations and pressures that sometimes worked against their efforts to be taken seriously by adult heroes and law enforcement agencies. The media attention that surrounded their early activities was a double-edged phenomenon that brought them recognition and public support, while also creating security concerns and unwanted scrutiny of their personal lives and secret identities. The headquarters that the Titans established provided them with a base of operations that was uniquely their own, free from the oversight and influence of adult mentors who might have imposed limitations or directions that conflicted with their developing sense of identity and purpose. The island location offered both security and symbolism, representing their independence, while also serving the practical requirements of a team whose members possessed abilities and equipment that required specialized facilities for training and maintenance. The cases that drew the Titans together during their early period were often threats that fell between the cracks of adult hero attention, situations that were too complex for individual young heroes to handle alone but not quite significant enough to warrant intervention by the Justice League or other established organizations. Their success in addressing these challenges proved that there was indeed a need for their particular combination of abilities and perspectives, validating their decision to work together, despite the skepticism of some adult observers. Dick's role as the team's leader emerged naturally from his experience working with Batman and his ability to think strategically about complex situations involving multiple variables and competing priorities. His circus background had taught him the importance of timing and coordination in group performances, skills that translated directly to tactical leadership in situations where split-second decisions could determine the difference between success and catastrophic failure. His natural charisma and genuine concern for his teammates' welfare made him someone they could trust and follow even when the dangers they faced seemed overwhelming. The balance between his responsibilities as Robin in Gotham City and his leadership of the Teen Titans created scheduling and priority conflicts that forced Dick to develop time management and decision-making skills that went far beyond anything required of most teenagers. Bruce's understanding and support for Dick's Titans activities reflected his recognition that the boy needed opportunities for peer interaction and independent leadership that their partnership, however valuable, could not provide. The psychological development that Dick experienced through his work with the Titans was as important as the practical skills he acquired in team leadership and coordination. Working with peers who shared similar backgrounds of extraordinary circumstances and heroic responsibilities provided him with social connections that helped normalize his own experiences, while also teaching him that he was not alone in facing the challenges that came with choosing to use exceptional abilities in service of others. The villains that the Titans faced during their early adventures were often individuals who had been corrupted by power or circumstance in ways that served as cautionary tales about the paths that young heroes might take if they allowed their abilities to be guided by selfish motivations rather than genuine desire to help others. The Brotherhood of Evil represented organized malevolence that required coordinated response, while threats like Dr. Light demonstrated how scientific knowledge could be perverted into instruments of harm rather than tools for advancement and healing. The international scope of some Titans' missions exposed Dick to global perspectives on heroism and justice that broadened his understanding beyond the American context in which he had been raised. These experiences taught him that evil was a universal phenomenon that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, while also revealing that heroism could manifest itself in countless different forms depending on local circumstances and traditions. The romantic relationships that developed between various team members added layers of complexity to group dynamics that required careful navigation to maintain team effectiveness, while also allowing for natural human emotional development. Dick's own growing attraction to certain teammates created internal conflicts between his leadership responsibilities and his personal feelings, teaching him lessons about compartmentalization and professional behavior that would serve him well throughout his heroic career. The media coverage of the Teen Titans' activities created public relations challenges that none of the young heroes had anticipated or been trained to handle effectively. The need to maintain secret identities while also building public trust and support required a delicate balance between openness and discretion that was further complicated by the different approaches that various team members preferred to take regarding their relationship with civilian authorities and news organizations. The technological resources that the Titans developed and maintained gave Dick his first experience with managing complex logistics and support systems that went beyond the resources that Batman had provided for their Gotham-based operations. Learning to coordinate equipment, procurement, maintenance schedules, and tactical planning for a team with diverse needs and capabilities taught him organizational skills that would prove invaluable in his later leadership roles. The educational opportunities that arose from working with teammates who possessed different types of knowledge and expertise created informal learning experiences that supplemented Dick's formal education in ways that no traditional school could have provided. Donner's warrior training introduced him to combat techniques and philosophical approaches that differed significantly from the methods that Bruce had taught him, while Wally's scientific background helped him understand the physics and chemistry behind various phenomena they encountered in their adventures. The failure and setbacks that the Titans experienced during their learning period taught Dick important lessons about resilience and adaptation that theoretical training could never have conveyed. The times when their missions went wrong or their coordination broke down under pressure provided opportunities to analyze mistakes and develop improved procedures, building the kind of practical wisdom that only came from actual experience in high-stakes situations. The relationships with adult heroes who served as mentors and advisors to various team members created complex dynamics that required Dick to learn how to maintain his leadership authority while also respecting the guidance and experience of older heroes who had legitimate concerns about the safety and development of their young protégés. These interactions taught him diplomatic skills that would serve him well throughout his career, as he learned to work with individuals who possessed different perspectives and priorities while maintaining focus on shared objectives. The public recognition that the Teen Titans achieved through their successful missions provided Dick with his first taste of fame and adulation that was independent of his connection to Batman, giving him confidence in his own abilities, while also teaching him about the responsibilities that came with being a public figure and role model for other young people who looked up to heroes for inspiration and guidance. The internal conflicts that occasionally arose between team members required Dick to develop mediation and conflict resolution skills that went far beyond the tactical leadership abilities he had been developing. Learning to help his teammates work through personal disagreements and philosophical differences while maintaining team cohesion taught him about human psychology and group dynamics that would prove invaluable throughout his life. The evolution of the Teen Titans from a temporary alliance to a permanent organization represented Dick's first major success in building something lasting and significant that was entirely his own creation rather than an extension of Batman's mission or methods. The pride and sense of accomplishment that came from this achievement gave him confidence in his ability to function independently while also strengthening his commitment to the ideals and values that had motivated him to become a hero in Doc's the first place. The growing tension between Dick's commitments to the Titans and his original role as Robin began to manifest itself in subtle ways that both he and Bruce initially tried to ignore, though the underlying issues would eventually require direct confrontation and resolution. The boy, who had once been content to serve as Batman's partner, was developing into a young man who needed opportunities for independence and self-determination that their established relationship could not easily accommodate. The recognition that Dick had outgrown his original role as the Boy Wonder was painful for both him and Bruce, though it was also inevitable given the natural human need for growth and development that could not be permanently constrained by even the most successful partnerships. The skills and confidence that Dick had gained through his work with the Titans had prepared him for greater responsibilities and challenges that would require him to step out from Batman's shadow and establish his own identity as a hero worthy of respect and recognition in his own right. The 17th year of Dick Grayson's life arrived like a thunderclap that shattered the delicate equilibrium he had maintained between his dual identities as Robin and as the leader of the Teen Titans, bringing with it challenges and revelations that would force him to confront fundamental questions about who he was becoming and what he truly wanted from his life as a hero. The birthday itself passed quietly within the walls of Wayne Manor, marked by Alfred's traditional cake and Bruce's thoughtful but restrained acknowledgement of another milestone in his ward's journey toward adulthood. Yet beneath the surface of these familiar rituals lay currents of change and tension that could no longer be ignored or postponed through simple avoidance. The physical changes that 17 years of intensive training and heroic activities had wrought upon Dick's body were unmistakable to anyone who had known him during his early days as Robin, transforming the slight, acrobatic boy into a young man whose strength and coordination had reached levels that would have impressed even his circus performer parents. His movements had acquired a fluidity and power that spoke of complete mastery over his physical capabilities, while his reflexes had been honed to the point where danger seemed to slow down around him, allowing him time to assess and respond to threats that would overwhelm less experienced fighters. Yet, the psychological development that accompanied these physical changes was perhaps even more significant, as Dick had evolved from an eager student, grateful for guidance and structure, into a confident leader, capable of making complex tactical decisions under extreme pressure, while managing the diverse personalities and capabilities of his Titan teammates. The boy who had once looked up to Batman with unconditional admiration now possessed enough experience and wisdom to recognize that even his mentor was fallible, that the methods and philosophies that had served Bruce well might not be the only or even the best approaches to every situation they encountered. The growing tension between Dick's responsibilities in Gotham City and his commitments to the Teen Titans had been building for months, though both he and Bruce had conspired to avoid direct confrontation about the fundamental incompatibilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or work around. The demands of coordinating and leading a team of young heroes required significant portions of Dick's time and attention, resources that were necessarily diverted from his partnership with Batman and his contributions to the protection of Gotham's citizens. The specific incident that would serve as the catalyst for their eventual confrontation began as a routine patrol through one of Gotham's more dangerous neighborhoods, an area where drug trafficking and gang violence had created an atmosphere of fear and desperation that drove decent families indoors after sunset while leaving the streets to predators and those who preyed upon human weakness and desperation. The intelligence that had drawn Batman and Robin to this particular location suggested that a major shipment of weapons was scheduled to change hands that night, a transaction that could significantly alter the balance of power among Gotham's criminal organizations. The warehouse where the weapons exchange was supposed to occur had been under surveillance for several days, with Batman's monitoring equipment providing detailed information about the security arrangements and personnel involved in the operation. The plan that Bruce had developed called for a coordinated approach that would allow them to intercept the weapons while also gathering intelligence about the broader criminal network that was facilitating this particular transaction. Objectives that required precise timing and flawless execution to accomplish without alerting other members of the organization. Dick's approach to the mission reflected the tactical thinking and leadership experience he had gained through his work with the Titans, leading him to suggest modifications to Bruce's plan that would have improved their chances of success, while also reducing the risks to innocent bystanders who might be caught in the crossfire if the operation went wrong. His recommendations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of urban combat dynamics and crowd psychology, insights that had been earned through real-world experience rather than theoretical study. Bruce's rejection of these suggestions was based not on their tactical merit, which he privately acknowledged was considerable, but on his growing concern about Dick's safety and his own psychological need to maintain control over situations that might endanger someone he had come to regard as a son. The protective instincts that had motivated his original decision to train Dick as his partner had intensified rather than diminished as the boy had grown older and more capable, creating a paradox where success and development actually increased Bruce's anxiety rather than reducing it. The ambush that awaited them in the warehouse was far more sophisticated and well prepared than their intelligence had suggested, indicating either a significant failure in their surveillance methods or deliberate misinformation designed to lure them into a trap. The criminal organization had anticipated their intervention and prepared countermeasures that included not only superior numbers and firepower, but also tactical coordination that suggested military training and professional leadership, rather than the typical amateur planning that characterized most street-level criminal enterprises. The battle that erupted when Batman and Robin entered the warehouse tested both their individual skills and their ability to coordinate their efforts under extreme pressure, as multiple groups of armed criminals attempted to surround and overwhelm them through sheer numbers and concentrated firepower. Dick's acrobatic abilities allowed him to avoid most of the incoming fire while positioning himself to attack from unexpected angles. Yet the confined space and multiple opponents created challenges that required every ounce of his training and experience to overcome. The Joker's sudden appearance in the midst of the firefight transformed what had been a dangerous but manageable situation into something approaching a nightmare scenario, as Gotham's most unpredictable and violent criminal brought his own agenda and methods to bear on a situation that was already stretched beyond the limits of careful planning and tactical preparation. His involvement suggested that the weapons exchange had been either a cover for something larger or an opportunity that he had chosen to exploit for his own twisted purposes. The gunshot that struck Dick in the shoulder came without warning during a moment when his attention was focused on protecting civilian workers who had been caught in the warehouse when the fighting began. His natural instinct to shield innocent bystanders from harm, creating a momentary vulnerability that the Joker was quick to exploit with the casual cruelty that characterized all his interactions with those who opposed his chaotic vision of existence. The impact spun Dick around and sent him crashing into a stack of shipping containers, the metallic clang of his body against steel mixing with the Joker's maniacal laughter to create a symphony of violence and pain. The wound itself was serious but not immediately life-threatening, the bullet having passed through muscle and tissue without striking bone or major blood vessels. Yet the psychological impact on Bruce was far more severe than the physical damage inflicted upon his partner. The sight of Dick's blood and the sound of his cry of pain triggered memories and fears, that Bruce had been suppressing for years, bringing to the surface all the doubts and terrors that came with caring deeply about someone who chose to place themselves in harm's way on a regular basis. Bruce's response to Dick's injury was swift and decisive, his fighting skills reaching a level of controlled fury that quickly overwhelmed the remaining criminals, while the Joker made his predictable escape through methods that seemed to mock the very concept of security and containment. The efficiency with which Batman cleared the warehouse of threats was matched only by the tenderness he showed in treating Dick's wound and ensuring his safe transport to medical facilities where the injury could be properly addressed by professionals who understood the unique requirements of treating costumed heroes. The recovery period that followed provided both Bruce and Dick with time to reflect on the incident and its implications for their continued partnership, though their conclusions about what the shooting meant and how they should respond to it differed significantly based on their different perspectives and priorities. For Bruce, the wound served as confirmation that his worst fears about Dick's safety were not only justified but understated, that continuing to allow him to participate in vigilante activities was an unconscionable risk that no rational person should accept. Dick's interpretation of the same events was fundamentally different, viewing his injury as an unfortunate but acceptable consequence of the heroic work he had chosen to pursue, no different from the risks that athletes, soldiers, or emergency responders accepted as part of their chosen professions. The bullet wound was healing properly and would leave no permanent damage, making it a temporary inconvenience rather than a life-changing catastrophe that required fundamental reconsideration of his goals and methods. The conversation that took place between Bruce and Dick during the second week of his recovery revealed the depth of the philosophical divide that had been growing between them for months, bringing to the surface disagreements about risk, responsibility, and the price that heroes should be willing to pay in pursuit of justice. Bruce's position was that no cause, however noble, justified exposing someone he loved to the kinds of dangers that had nearly claimed Dick's life, while Dick argued that meaningful existence required the acceptance of risks in service of purposes greater than personal safety and comfort. The ultimatum that Bruce delivered was presented not as punishment or rejection, but as a final attempt to protect someone whose welfare had become more important to him than his own, though the effect was the same regardless of the motivations behind it. If Dick could no longer accept Bruce's authority and judgment in matters relating to their partnership, then he could no longer serve as Robin, for the role required trust and coordination that became impossible when the participants held fundamentally different views about acceptable levels of risk and appropriate methods of operation. The finality of Bruce's position left Dick with limited options, none of which felt satisfactory or complete given the complexity of his feelings about their relationship and his own developing sense of identity and purpose. He could accept Bruce's terms and continue as Robin under conditions that felt increasingly constraining and infantilizing, or he could reject those terms and face the loss of not only his partnership with Batman but also his connection to the work and identity that had given meaning to his life since his parents' death. The decision to leave Wayne Manor and seek counsel elsewhere was motivated not by anger or rebellion, but by genuine confusion about how to resolve conflicts that seemed to admit no compromise or middle ground that would satisfy both parties. The weight of choosing between loyalty to his mentor and commitment to his own growing sense of autonomy created emotional pressures that required input from someone who could provide perspective and wisdom without the emotional investment that made objective analysis impossible for either Bruce or Dick. The flight to Metropolis and his meeting with Superman represented Dick's first major decision as an independent agent rather than as Bruce's partner or ward, though the choice of advisor reflected his continued respect for heroic values. and his desire to find guidance from someone who had successfully navigated similar challenges in his own career. The Man of Steel's reputation for wisdom and moral clarity made him an ideal counselor for someone facing fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, and personal development. The rooftop conversation that took place between Superman and Dick unfolded against the backdrop of Metropolis at sunset, the city's gleaming towers and busy streets, providing a contrast to Gotham's darker and more oppressive atmosphere, while serving as a reminder that heroism could manifest itself in different forms and environments depending on local needs and individual capabilities. The informal setting and Superman's genuine interest in Dick's dilemma created an atmosphere of trust and openness that encouraged honest discussion of complex issues. The story that Superman shared about Krypton's ancient history in the original Nightwing was presented not as direct advice but as an example of how individuals could honor their heritage while also forging new paths that reflected their own values and circumstances. The tale of a man who had been cast out by his family yet had found purpose and meaning through service to others resonated with Dick's own situation, while also providing him with a possible framework for moving forward without Dick's abandoning either his principles or his connections to those who had shaped his development. The legend of Nightwing and Flamebird spoke of partnership and independence, of individuals who had chosen to work together while maintaining their separate identities and approaches to the challenges they faced. The original Nightwing had been someone who refused to let family rejection define his future. Instead, creating his own legacy through dedication to justice and protection of those who could not protect themselves, values that aligned perfectly with Dick's own moral convictions and heroic aspirations. The decision to adopt the Nightwing identity was made not in rejection of his past as Robin, but in recognition that growth required evolution, that honoring the lessons he had learned from Bruce meant applying them independently rather than remaining forever in the role of student and junior partner. The name represented both continuity and change, acknowledging the foundation that others had provided while asserting his readiness to build upon that foundation in ways that reflected his own vision and capabilities. The costume design process that followed Dick's choice of identity provided him with opportunities to express his artistic vision, while also addressing the practical requirements of his evolved approach to crime fighting. The blue and black color scheme honored both his circus heritage and his connection to the night, while the design's emphasis on mobility and flexibility reflected his acrobatic background and his preference for tactics that emphasized speed and agility over raw power or intimidation. The symbolic significance of the Nightwing costume extended beyond mere visual appeal to encompass psychological and emotional dimensions that supported Dick's developing sense of independent identity. The bird motif connected him to his Robin heritage, while also suggesting flight and freedom, qualities that had defined his circus upbringing and his approach to heroic work. The mature design reflected his evolution from boy wonder to adult hero, marking a transition that was as much internal as external. The return to the Teen Titans as their leader represented Dick's first official act as Nightwing, providing him with a supportive environment in which to develop his new identity, while also demonstrating his continued commitment to the heroic ideals that had motivated his original decision to become Robin. His teammates' enthusiastic acceptance of his transformation validated his choices while also confirming that leadership was indeed his natural role, rather than simply a temporary assignment. The psychological liberation that accompanied Dick's transformation into Nightwing was perhaps more significant than any of the external changes in costume or base of operations, representing his emergence from the shadow of others' expectations and his acceptance of full responsibility for his own choices and their consequences. The young man who had once looked to Batman for guidance and approval now trusted his own judgment while remaining open to advice and collaboration from those whose wisdom and experience he respected. The establishment of Nightwing as a distinct hero with his own methods and territory marked the beginning of a new chapter in Dick's heroic career, one that would test all the lessons he had learned, while also providing him with opportunities to develop new skills and approaches that reflected his unique perspective and capabilities. The boy who had fallen from the circus trapeze had learnt to fly again, but now he soared under his own power through skies of his own choosing, guided by principles that honored his past, while embracing the infinite possibilities that the future might hold. The impact of Dick's transformation on his relationship with Bruce would require time and distance to fully assess, though both men understood that something fundamental had changed between them that could never be entirely repaired or restored to its previous state. The mentor had succeeded perhaps too well in preparing his student for independence, creating someone capable of standing on his own, even when that independence came at the cost of partnership and shared purpose. Yet the values and skills that Bruce had instilled in Dick remained intact despite their changed relationship, ensuring that the investment of time, energy, and emotional commitment that had gone into Robin's training would continue to benefit not only Dick himself, but all those who would benefit from his protection and service in his new identity. The first Robin had become something greater and more complex than his mentor could have imagined, a testament to the transformative power of guidance combined with individual determination and growth. The legacy of Robin would continue through others who would claim the title, yet none would ever quite replicate the unique combination of circumstances and characteristics that had made Dick Grayson's tenure in the role so significant and influential. He had established the template for heroic partnership, while also demonstrating that such partnerships, however successful, were ultimately temporary arrangements that served their purpose and then evolved into new forms of connection and mutual respect. The mantle of leadership that Dick Grayson assumed as Nightwing brought with it responsibilities and challenges that tested every lesson he had learned during his years as Robin. Yet the crucible of command would reveal depths of character and capability that even his closest allies had not fully recognized or anticipated. The Teen Titans, who had grown accustomed to his guidance and tactical brilliance during their previous adventures, now looked to him not merely as a peer who happened to possess exceptional skills, but as the definitive voice of authority whose decisions would determine their success or failure in confronting threats that seemed to grow more complex and dangerous with each passing month. The first major crisis that Nightwing faced as the undisputed leader of the Titans emerged from the shadows of religious extremism and supernatural manipulation. As the cult of Brother Blood began implementing schemes that combined ancient mystical practices with modern psychological warfare techniques to create a form of mind control that was both scientifically sophisticated and spiritually corrupting. The organization's ability to recruit followers from diverse backgrounds and social strata demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond typical criminal enterprises, suggesting leadership that understood human psychology and societal vulnerabilities with disturbing precision and insight. Brother Blood himself represented a form of evil that Dick had never previously encountered, combining genuine charisma and intellectual brilliance with complete moral emptiness in ways that made him simultaneously compelling and repulsive to anyone who came into contact with his teachings and methods. His ability to present the most heinous acts as necessary steps towards spiritual enlightenment created cognitive dissonance that confused even strong-willed individuals, while his mastery of psychological manipulation techniques allowed him to identify and exploit the deepest fears and insecurities of potential converts with surgical precision. The investigation that led the Titans into Brother Blood's sphere of influence began with seemingly unrelated disappearances of young people from cities across the eastern seaboard, incidents that individually appeared to be typical runaway cases or random crimes, but which collectively suggested a pattern of systematic recruitment that targeted individuals with specific psychological profiles and personal vulnerabilities. Dick's detective training enabled him to recognize connections that local law enforcement agencies had missed. Yet the scope and sophistication of the operation indicated resources and planning capabilities that exceeded anything the Titans had previously confronted. The infiltration mission that Dick designed to gather intelligence about Brother Blood's operations required him to assume a false identity and undergo psychological conditioning that would make him appear vulnerable to the cult's recruitment methods while maintaining sufficient mental defenses to avoid genuine conversion or compromisation. The risks involved in such deep cover work were enormous, as the cult screening processes were designed to detect deception and eliminate potential threats before they could gather meaningful intelligence or disrupt ongoing activities. The brainwashing techniques that Brother Blood employed represented a sophisticated fusion of ancient ritualistic practices with cutting-edge neuroscience and pharmaceutical intervention, creating a multi-layered assault on individual consciousness that attacked both rational thinking and emotional stability simultaneously. The process began with isolation from familiar social support systems and gradual introduction of new belief structures that seemed reasonable and beneficial when presented in carefully controlled contexts, yet which collectively formed a worldview that justified any action deemed necessary by the cult's leadership. Dick's experience as a subject of these techniques provided him with first-hand knowledge of how insidious and effective such manipulation could be, as he found himself genuinely questioning beliefs and values that had seemed unshakable throughout his heroic career. The gradual erosion of certainty about fundamental moral principles created internal conflicts that were as psychologically devastating as any physical torture could have been, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire identity as a hero might be based on illusions and self-deception, rather than genuine understanding of right and wrong. The rescue mission that his teammates launched to extract him from Brother Blood's compound tested their abilities and coordination in ways that their previous adventures had not prepared them for, as they were forced to navigate not only physical obstacles and armed resistance, but also the psychological reality that their leader might have been fundamentally changed by his experiences. The possibility that Dick could emerge from his captivity as an enemy rather than an ally created strategic and emotional complications that threatened to paralyze their response efforts. The battle that erupted during the extraction attempt revealed the full extent of Brother Blood's power and the genuine supernatural elements that enhanced his already formidable psychological and technological capabilities. His ability to manipulate reality itself through mystical means transformed what should have been a straightforward rescue operation into a nightmarish ordeal that tested the limits of each team member's courage and resourcefulness, while forcing them to confront fears and doubts that had been buried beneath their heroic personas. Dick's recovery from the brainwashing experience was neither quick nor complete, requiring months of patient work with both professional therapists and trusted friends who could help him rebuild his sense of identity and moral certainty. The knowledge that his mind had been violated and manipulated in ways that made him question his most fundamental beliefs created lasting psychological scars that would influence his approach to leadership and personal relationships for years to come, though the experience also provided him with insights into human psychology and vulnerability that would make him more effective in helping others who faced similar challenges. The news of Jason Todd's selection as the new Robin reached Dick through unofficial channels before Bruce made any attempt to inform him directly, creating a complex mixture of emotions that included hurt, understanding, curiosity, and genuine concern for a boy who was about to embark upon the same dangerous path that had defined Dick's own adolescence. The realization that Bruce had moved forward with training a replacement without consulting or even informing his former partner highlighted the ongoing distance between them, while also confirming Dick's decision to establish his independence had been necessary and appropriate. Jason's background as a street orphan who had survived through quick wits and determination created both parallels and contrasts with Dick's own origin story, suggesting that Bruce might be attempting to replicate the success of their partnership, while also acknowledging that different circumstances would require different approaches to training and mentorship. The reports that filtered back to Dick through various sources painted a picture of a young man whose anger and pain were more prominent than his predecessors had been, though his courage and potential for growth seemed equally impressive. The psychological dynamics of Bruce's relationship with his new Robin appeared to differ significantly from those that had characterized his partnership with Dick, reflecting both the mentor's evolving understanding of his role and the very different personality and needs that Jason brought to the position. The older man's attempts to provide structure and guidance for someone whose early experiences had been so different from Dick's circus upbringing required adaptations and adjustments that tested his flexibility and emotional intelligence in ways that his previous mentoring experience had not fully prepared him for. Dick's feelings about Jason's tenure as Robin were complicated by his genuine desire to see both Bruce and the new boy Wonder succeed in their partnership, while also experiencing natural human emotions of displacement and loss that he struggled to process and integrate with his more noble intentions. The knowledge that someone else was living in his former bedroom wearing a version of his former costume and working alongside the man who had been the most important figure in his life created an ongoing sense of disconnection and melancholy that no amount of rational understanding could entirely eliminate. The tragic news of Jason's death at the Joker's hands reached Dick during a particularly challenging period in his own heroic career, when the responsibilities of leadership and the ongoing psychological after-effects of his encounter with Brother Blood had left him emotionally vulnerable and struggling to maintain the optimistic outlook that had always been one of his greatest strengths. The knowledge that another young person had paid the ultimate price for choosing the path of heroism created guilt and self-recrimination that went far beyond rational assessment of responsibility and causation. The funeral service for Jason Todd was conducted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all of Bruce's responses to personal loss. Yet the emotional toll on everyone who had known the second Robin was unmistakable, despite their efforts to maintain professional composure and focus on their continuing responsibilities. Dick's presence at the ceremony represented both a gesture of respect for his successor and an attempt to provide whatever comfort and support he could offer to Bruce during what was clearly one of the most difficult periods of his life. The revelation about Tony Zuko's survival came through intelligence networks that Dick had been maintaining independently of his former connections to Batman's operations, providing him with information that Bruce had been deliberately withholding for reasons that initially seemed incomprehensible, given their shared investment in seeing justice done for the murder of Dick's parents. The knowledge that the man responsible for his family's death had been alive all these years while Dick believed him to be dead created a sense of betrayal that went beyond mere deception to encompass questions about trust, protection, and the fundamental honesty that should characterize relationships between people who claim to care about each other. Bruce's explanation for his deception was rooted in genuine concern for Dick's emotional well-being and his desire to protect him from the kind of vengeful impulses that might have compromised his development as a hero and as a person. Yet, The paternalistic assumptions underlying this decision reflected a failure to recognize that Dick had grown beyond the need for such protection and deserved the right to make his own choices about how to respond to information about his parents' killer. The discovery that Bruce had been monitoring Zuko's situation and making unilateral decisions about Dick's access to justice created resentment and disappointment that would prove difficult to overcome. The irony of Zuko's eventual death by assassination just as Dick arrived to confront him provided a form of cosmic justice that satisfied no one, leaving both closure and frustration in its wake, as the opportunity for genuine resolution was forever lost to the random violence that characterized Gotham's criminal underworld. The assassin's bullets eliminated not only Zuko himself, but also any possibility of the kind of direct confrontation and accountability that Dick had been imagining and preparing for since learning of his enemy's survival. The investigation and capture of Zuko's killer provided Dick with some measure of satisfaction and professional accomplishment, demonstrating that his detective skills and tactical abilities had continued to develop during his time away from Bruce's direct supervision. Yet the entire experience left him with a sense of incompleteness and frustration that no amount of successful police work could entirely address. The complicated emotions surrounding his parents' murder and the various deceptions that had surrounded it would require years of processing and reflection before he could achieve genuine peace with the past. The strain that these revelations placed upon Dick's relationship with Bruce was compounded by their existing disagreements about independence, authority, and the appropriate boundaries between mentor and student, creating a situation where rational discussion and mutual understanding became increasingly difficult despite the genuine affection and respect that both men continued to feel for each other. The accumulation of unresolved conflicts and hurt feelings created a barrier to communication that neither seemed capable of overcoming through their usual methods of careful avoidance and professional focus. The arrival of Tim Drake in Dick's life represented an unexpected opportunity for connection with someone who understood the unique challenges and responsibilities that came with being Robin, while also providing him with chances to serve as a mentor and guide for someone who was just beginning the same journey that had defined so much of his own development. The younger boy's intelligence and determination reminded Dick of his own eagerness and idealism during his early days as Batman's partner, creating both nostalgia and a sense of protective responsibility that he had not previously experienced. Tim's initial request that Dick return to the role of Robin was both touching and impossible, reflecting the younger boy's understanding that something important had been lost with Dick's departure, while failing to recognize that growth and change were natural and necessary parts of human development that could not be reversed through simple desire or good intentions. The suggestion that Dick could somehow reclaim his former identity demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both personal evolution and the nature of heroic identity that would require patient explanation and guidance to address properly. Dick's refusal to resume his role as Robin was based not on rejection of his past or lack of caring for Bruce and the mission they had shared, but rather on recognition that attempting to return to a previous stage of development would be both psychologically unhealthy and practically impossible given how much he had changed during his time as Nightwing. The lessons he had learned about leadership, independence, and personal responsibility could not be unlearned or set aside, making any attempt to reclaim his former subordinate role an exercise in self-denial that would benefit no one. The mentoring relationship that developed between Dick and Tim provided both young men with valuable opportunities for growth and understanding, as Dick learned to guide and support someone else's development, while Tim gained access to insights and perspectives that could only come from someone who had successfully navigated the same challenges and transitions that lay ahead of him. Their conversations about the responsibilities and dangers of heroic work created bonds of mutual respect and affection that would endure throughout their careers, despite the differences in their ages and experiences. Dick's advocacy for Tim's candidacy as the third Robin represented a significant evolution in his relationship with Bruce, demonstrating his willingness to set aside personal hurt and disappointment in order to support decisions that would benefit both his former mentor and the broader mission of protecting Gotham's citizens. The arguments he presented on Tim's behalf were based on careful observation of the younger boy's capabilities and character, rather than simple emotional attachment, reflecting the analytical skills and leadership experience that his time with the Titans had developed. The eventual selection of Tim Drake as Robin validated Dick's judgment, while also providing him with the satisfaction of knowing that he had played a constructive role in ensuring continuity for the heroic legacy that had been so important in his own development. The knowledge that Bruce would once again have a partner to share the burdens and dangers of his mission provided Dick with peace of mind that helped offset some of the lingering resentment and disappointment that had characterized their relationship since his departure from Wayne Manor. The psychological significance of Dick's role in Tim's selection, as Robin extended beyond the immediate practical benefits to encompass important symbolic dimensions related to generational continuity and the passing of wisdom and responsibility from one hero to the next. By supporting Tim's candidacy and helping to prepare him for the challenges ahead, Dick was participating in the same kind of mentoring and guidance that Bruce had provided for him, though from a different position and with a different perspective on the process. The ongoing evolution of Dick's relationship with Bruce would require continued patience and effort from both men as they learned to navigate the complex dynamics of their changed circumstances while maintaining their shared commitment to heroic ideals and the protection of innocent life. The foundation of mutual respect and affection that had been established during Dick's years as Robin remained strong despite the strains and conflicts that had developed, suggesting that genuine reconciliation and renewed partnership might be possible if both were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward better understanding of each other's perspectives and needs. The legacy of Dick's time as Robin was secure not only in his own continued heroic career, but also in the example and inspiration he had provided for the young heroes who would follow in his footsteps, demonstrating that it was possible to honor one's origins and training, while also growing beyond them into new forms of service and leadership that reflected individual talents and calling, rather than simply replicating the patterns established by previous generations of heroes. The specter of catastrophic defeat that had haunted Bruce Wayne since the early days of his war against crime finally materialized not through supernatural intervention or cosmic accident, but through the methodical application of superior strategy and overwhelming physical force by an enemy who had studied Batman's methods with the patience of a scholar and the ruthlessness of a predator. Bane's arrival in Gotham City marked the beginning of what would become known as the Nightfall Saga, a period of darkness and upheaval that would test not only Bruce's physical capabilities, but also the entire network of relationships and responsibilities that he had constructed around his dual identity as billionaire philanthropist and nocturnal vigilante. The systematic campaign that Bane orchestrated to weaken Batman before their inevitable confrontation demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond the crude approaches favored by most of Gotham's criminal population, incorporating elements of psychological warfare, resource depletion, and tactical misdirection that forced Bruce to expend his energy and attention on multiple fronts simultaneously. The breakout at Arkham Asylum that released dozens of dangerous criminals into Gotham streets was not merely an act of chaos, but a carefully calculated move designed to exhaust Batman's physical and mental reserves, while also demonstrating the futility of his mission to protect a city that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. The weeks that followed the mass escape saw Bruce pushing himself beyond all reasonable limits as he attempted to recapture the escaped inmates while also maintaining his responsibilities as head of Wayne Enterprises and his various philanthropic endeavors, creating a level of sustained stress and sleep deprivation that would have broken lesser individuals, but which Bruce accepted as necessary sacrifices in service of his mission. The toll that this relentless pace took on his body and mind was evident to those who worked closely with him, yet his determination to handle every crisis personally prevented him from seeking the assistance that might have preserved his strength for the greater challenge that was approaching. Tim Drake's presence as the new Robin provided some measure of support and companionship during this difficult period, though the third Boy Wonder was still developing the skills and experience that would eventually make him an equal partner in Batman's crusade, rather than simply a capable assistant who required protection and guidance. The psychological burden of training a new Robin, while also dealing with the escalating criminal activity, created additional stress that compounded the physical exhaustion that was gradually eroding Bruce's effectiveness and judgment. The final confrontation between Batman and Bane took place in the depths of Wayne Manor itself, in the very heart of the sanctuary that Bruce had believed to be inviolate and secure from the reach of his enemies. Yet Bane's discovery of his secret identity had eliminated any possibility of refuge or strategic withdrawal from a battle that would determine not only his personal fate, but the future of Batman's war against crime. The fight that ensued was less a contest between equals than a methodical destruction of a weakened opponent by a physically superior adversary who had chosen the time and place of their encounter with devastating precision. The sound of Bruce's spine breaking under the pressure of Bane's grip echoed through the Batcave like a death knell for the heroic identity that had defined his adult life, transforming him in an instant from Gotham's most feared protector into a broken man whose body could no longer support the demands of his chosen mission. The paralysis that followed was not merely a physical condition, but a psychological catastrophe that forced him to confront the possibility that his war against crime had finally reached its inevitable conclusion through his own defeat, rather than ultimate victory. The news of Batman's apparent death spread through Gotham's criminal underworld with the speed of wildfire, creating a power vacuum that various factions immediately began attempting to fill through violence and intimidation that threatened to tear the city apart in ways that even its long history of corruption and crime had not prepared it to withstand. The absence of Batman's deterrent effect emboldened criminals who had previously operated with caution and restraint, while also creating opportunities for new players to establish themselves through spectacular acts of violence and terror. Dick's initial reluctance to return to Gotham during this crisis was rooted not in indifference to Bruce's suffering, but in the complex mixture of hurt, anger, and uncertainty that had characterized their relationship since his departure from Wayne Manor years earlier, creating emotional barriers that made it difficult for him to separate his personal feelings from his professional assessment of what the situation required. The reports reaching him through various sources painted a picture of chaos and violence that suggested Gotham needed Batman's presence more urgently than ever, yet the knowledge that Bruce had chosen someone else to fill that role created hesitation about inserting himself into a situation where his intervention might not be welcome or appropriate. The deteriorating situation under Jean-Paul Valley's increasingly violent and unstable leadership as the new Batman finally overcame Dick's reservations and drew him back to the city where he had learned to be a hero, though his return was motivated as much by concern for Tim Drake's safety as by any desire to reconcile with Bruce or reclaim his former position in Gotham's heroic hierarchy. The reports of Azrael Batman's methods and psychological state suggested that the man Bruce had chosen as his successor was transforming the Batman identity into something that violated every principle that had originally made it, a force for justice rather than mere vengeance. The reunion between Dick and Tim took place under circumstances that highlighted both the urgency of the current crisis and the continuing bonds of affection and mutual respect that connected all those who had worn the Robin costume, creating a partnership that combined Dick's experience and leadership abilities with Tim's analytical skills and fresh perspective on the challenges they faced together. Their collaboration during the early stages of the campaign to contain Valley's excesses demonstrated that the Robin legacy had indeed created lasting connections that transcended individual differences and personal conflicts. The psychological profile that Dick was able to construct of Jean-Paul Valley through direct observation and analysis of his actions revealed a mind that had been shaped by conditioning and trauma in ways that made him fundamentally unsuited for the kind of measured response that effective crime fighting required, yet whose physical capabilities and tactical knowledge made him too dangerous to confront through conventional means. The religious fanaticism and barely suppressed violence that characterized Valley's approach to his role as Batman created a situation where the cure had become potentially worse than the disease it was meant to address. The strategy that Dick developed for countering Valley's influence required careful coordination with other members of Gotham's heroic community, including individuals who had previously operated independently, but who recognized that the current crisis demanded unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual support. The alliance that formed around Dick's leadership brought together heroes with diverse backgrounds and methodologies, yet who shared a common commitment to preserving the principles that Batman had traditionally represented, rather than allowing them to be corrupted by extremism and fanaticism. The campaign against Azrael Batman unfolded across multiple fronts simultaneously, as Dick and his allies worked to document Valley's excesses, while also protecting innocent civilians from the collateral damage created by his increasingly violent methods, and seeking ways to minimize the long-term damage to Batman's reputation and effectiveness as a symbol of justice. The delicate balance between opposing Valley's actions and avoiding public revelations that might compromise the entire Batman operation required diplomatic skills and strategic thinking that tested Dick's leadership abilities in ways that his previous experiences had not fully prepared him for. Bruce's gradual recovery from his injuries provided both hope and complications for those working to restore order to Gotham's heroic community, as his physical rehabilitation was accompanied by psychological struggles related to his forced inactivity and his growing awareness of the mistakes he had made in selecting and preparing Valley as his successor. The combination of guilt, frustration, and physical pain created emotional volatility that made him a difficult patient and an unreliable advisor, yet his knowledge and experience remained invaluable resources for those attempting to clean up the mess his absence had created. The final confrontation that removed Valley from his position as Batman required the combined efforts of Dick, Tim, Bruce, and even Catwoman, demonstrating both the seriousness of the threat he had become and the strength of the bonds that connected those who truly understood what the Batman identity was meant to represent. The battle was as much psychological as physical, requiring them to break through the conditioning and fanaticism that had transformed Valley from a potential ally into a dangerous enemy who threatened everything they had worked to protect. Bruce's decision to ask Dick to serve as Batman during his continued recovery represented both an acknowledgement of his former partner's capabilities and a tacit admission that his earlier reluctance to consider Dick for the role had been based on emotional rather than rational considerations. The offer was presented not as charity or temporary expedient, but as recognition that Dick possessed the qualities and experience necessary to preserve the Batman legacy during a critical period when Gotham needed strong and principled leadership more than ever. The psychological impact of wearing the Batman costume for the first time was profound and transformative for Dick, creating an immediate understanding of both the power and the burden that came with assuming an identity that had become legendary throughout Gotham and beyond, yet which also carried expectations and responsibilities that differed significantly from those associated with his Nightwing persona. The weight of the cape and cowl was both literal and metaphorical, representing not only the physical accoutrements of the role, but also the enormous responsibility for protecting an entire city's population from threats that ranged from street crime to cosmic catastrophes. The early cases that Dick handled as Batman tested his ability to adapt his fighting style and investigative methods to the requirements of an identity that relied more heavily on intimidation and psychological warfare than his previous approach as Nightwing had emphasized. Yet his natural charisma and acrobatic skills allowed him to develop his own interpretation of the Batman role that remained true to its core principles, while also reflecting his unique personality and capabilities. The criminals he encountered quickly learned that this new Batman was different from his predecessor in style and methodology, yet no less effective in pursuing justice and protecting innocent life. The confrontation with Two-Face that occurred during Dick's tenure, as Batman provided him with opportunities to test his detective skills against one of Gotham's most psychologically complex villains, while also allowing him to address some of the unresolved issues from his own past that had been creating internal conflicts and self-doubt. The case forced him to confront questions about justice, mercy, and the nature of evil that went beyond simple law enforcement to encompass deeper philosophical issues about human nature and the possibility of redemption for those who had chosen darkness over light. The partnership that developed between Dick and Tim during this period represented an evolution in their relationship from mentor and student to something approaching equality, as Tim's analytical abilities and technological expertise complemented Dick's leadership skills and combat experience in ways that created a more collaborative dynamic than had existed in previous Batman-Robin partnerships. Their success in working together validated Dick's belief that effective heroism required cooperation and mutual respect rather than simple hierarchy and obedience to authority. The public response to Dick's performance as Batman was generally positive, though observant citizens and criminals alike noticed differences in style and approach that suggested this was indeed a different individual wearing the costume, rather than simply Batman displaying new tactics or recovered from previous injuries. The speculation about Batman's true identity was nothing new, yet the subtle changes in behavior and methodology created additional questions that required careful management to avoid compromising the secret that protected not only Bruce Wayne, but everyone connected to the Batman operation. The psychological rewards that Dick experienced from his temporary tenure as Batman included not only the satisfaction of successful crime fighting, but also a deeper understanding of Bruce's motivations and the tremendous pressure that came with being responsible for an entire city's safety and security, creating empathy and respect for his former mentor that helped heal some of the wounds that had developed in their relationship over the years. The experience taught him that leadership at this level required sacrifices and compromises that were not always visible to those who worked alongside or under such leaders. Bruce's return to active duty as Batman marked the end of Dick's official tenure in the role, though the experience had changed him in ways that would influence his approach to heroism for the remainder of his career, while also providing him with insights and capabilities that would prove valuable in future leadership positions and crisis situations. The transition back to his Nightwing identity was accomplished with grace and professionalism, demonstrating his emotional maturity and commitment to the greater good over personal ambition or ego satisfaction. The conversation that took place between Bruce and Dick during the transition period provided both men with opportunities to address some of the lingering issues and misunderstandings that had complicated their relationship since Dick's departure from Wayne Manor, creating possibilities for genuine reconciliation and renewed friendship based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than the hierarchical dynamics that had previously defined their interactions. The discussion was honest and sometimes painful, yet it established a foundation for future cooperation and collaboration that acknowledged both men's growth and development since their original partnership had ended. Bruce's explanation for his original reluctance to consider Dick as his successor was rooted in protective instincts and emotional attachment that had prevented him from recognizing his former partner's readiness for greater responsibilities, creating a situation where personal feelings had interfered with rational assessment of capabilities and qualifications in ways that had been unfair to both of them. The admission represented a form of vulnerability and honesty that had been rare in their previous interactions, suggesting genuine progress toward the kind of open communication that healthy relationships required. The healing that began during this period of crisis and cooperation would continue to develop over subsequent years, as both men learned to appreciate each other's unique contributions to their shared mission, while also respecting the Cajun independence and individual growth that had made their temporary reunion both necessary and successful. The experience of working together as equals, rather than mentor and student, had demonstrated that their relationship could evolve and mature in ways that honored their past, while also embracing new possibilities for collaboration and mutual support. The legacy of Dick's service as Batman would extend far beyond the immediate practical benefits to encompass symbolic and psychological dimensions that affected not only his own development, but also the broader understanding within Gotham's heroic community about leadership, succession, and the importance of maintaining institutional continuity during periods of crisis and transition. The successful temporary transfer of the Batman mantle had proven that the identity was larger than any single individual, while also demonstrating the importance of choosing successors based on character and capability rather than convenience or emotional attachment. The bonds between Dick, Bruce, and Tim that were strengthened during this period of crisis and cooperation would prove invaluable in future challenges that required their combined efforts and expertise, creating a foundation of trust and mutual respect that transcended the formal relationships of mentor and student or leader and follower to encompass genuine friendship and family loyalty that would endure regardless of the specific roles and responsibilities that circumstances might require them to assume. The boy who had once been Robin had indeed grown into a man worthy of wearing the Batman mantle, though his greatest contributions would ultimately come through his unique identity as Nightwing rather than through imitation of his mentor's methods and approach. The political machinations that infiltrated the Teen Titans during the height of their effectiveness as an independent heroic organization represented more than simple governmental oversight or bureaucratic interference. They constituted a fundamental assault on the principles of autonomous heroism that had allowed young metahumans to develop their capabilities and moral judgment, free from the corrupting influences of institutional agendas and adult prejudices. The decision by federal authorities to impose new leadership structures and operational protocols upon the Titans reflected broader societal anxieties about superhuman abilities operating beyond traditional chains of command and accountability, yet the specific implementation of these policies demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of what had made the team successful in their mission to protect innocent lives while nurturing the development of the next generation of heroes. Roy Harper's appointment as the new leader of the Titans under his Arsenal identity was presented by government officials as a logical choice based on his experience and proven track record as a hero, yet the selection process ignored the complex interpersonal dynamics and established traditions that had allowed the team to function effectively under Dick's guidance for years. The assumption that leadership could be transferred through administrative decree rather than earned through demonstrated competence and team consensus revealed the bureaucratic mindset's failure to comprehend the organic nature of heroic relationships and the importance of trust and mutual respect in life or death situations. The psychological impact of this forced transition on Dick was profound and multifaceted, encompassing not only personal disappointment at losing his leadership role, but also genuine concern for the welfare of teammates who had become like family during their shared adventures and mutual support through countless dangers and challenges. The knowledge that his removal from command was based on political considerations rather than any failure of performance or judgment created resentment that was compounded by his inability to protect his friends from decisions that he believed would ultimately prove harmful to their effectiveness and possibly their safety. Arsenal's approach to team leadership reflected both his different personality and the external pressures that came with his government-sanctioned authority, creating changes in operational procedures and strategic priorities that altered the fundamental character of the Titans in ways that went beyond simple administrative adjustments to encompass philosophical shifts about the relationship between heroism and state power. The emphasis on coordination with federal agencies and adherence to official protocols limited the team's flexibility and spontaneity, qualities that had previously allowed them to respond rapidly to emerging threats and adapt their tactics to unique circumstances. The individual team members' responses to these changes varied according to their personal relationships with both Dick and Roy, their political beliefs about government involvement in heroic activities, and their assessment of how the new structure affected their ability to pursue their heroic goals effectively and safely. Some welcomed the additional resources and official recognition that came with government backing, while others shared Dick's concerns about the loss of independence and the potential for mission creep that might transform them from heroes into mere instruments of state policy. Dick's decision to leave the Titans was made not in anger or rebellion, but from a clear-eyed assessment that his continued presence under the new leadership structure would create tensions and conflicts that would ultimately harm the team's effectiveness while also preventing him from pursuing his own evolving understanding of his role and responsibilities as a hero. The choice required him to prioritize the greater good over his personal attachments and comfort, demonstrating the emotional maturity and selfless commitment that had always characterized his approach to heroic service. The transition period that followed Dick's departure from the Titans was marked by uncertainty about his future direction and purpose, as he found himself without the institutional affiliations and regular partnerships that had provided structure and meaning to his heroic activities for years. The independence he had gained came with the burden of complete responsibility for defining his own mission and methods, requiring him to develop new approaches to crime fighting that reflected his individual capabilities and moral convictions, rather than team consensus and collaborative decision-making. The focus on Gotham City that emerged during this period represented both a return to his origins and an evolution of his understanding of how he could most effectively contribute to the cause of justice and public safety. The city where he had learned to be a hero remained a place where his skills and knowledge could make a meaningful difference, Yet his approach to protecting its citizens differed significantly from the methods he had employed as Robin, or the strategies he had developed as leader of the Titans. The news of Bruce Wayne's apparent death reached Dick through media reports rather than personal communication, highlighting the continued distance between them despite their reconciliation during the Azrael crisis, and the mutual respect that had developed from that shared experience. The circumstances surrounding Bruce's alleged demise were complex and suspicious, involving criminal charges and evidence that seemed inconsistent with everything Dick knew about his former mentor's character and methods. Yet the legal and political realities created situations where personal knowledge and emotional conviction carried little weight against official findings and public perception. The investigation that Dick conducted into the circumstances of Bruce's legal troubles revealed patterns of manipulation and evidence fabrication that suggested a sophisticated conspiracy designed to destroy Batman's base effectiveness by targeting his civilian identity and financial resources, rather than confronting him directly in physical combat. The conspiracy's success in turning public opinion against Bruce Wayne demonstrated the vulnerability of heroes who maintained dual identities to attacks that exploited legal and social institutions rather than relying on conventional, criminal methods. The emotional impact of losing Bruce, even under circumstances that Dick suspected were not what they appeared to be, forced him to confront his own mortality and the temporary nature of all heroic partnerships and mentoring relationships, while also highlighting the importance of the lessons and values that transcended individual personalities and specific relationships. The grief that he experienced was complicated by uncertainty about the truth of the situation and by his inability to openly mourn someone whose death he could not accept as genuine. Tim Drake's continued work as Robin during this crisis provided Dick with both comfort and concern, as he worried about the younger hero's safety and emotional well-being, while also taking pride in his continued dedication to their shared mission. Despite the apparent loss of their mentor and father figure, the partnership that had developed between them during previous challenges created bonds of mutual support and understanding that helped both navigate the difficulties of this period while maintaining their commitment to protecting innocent lives. The emergence of Jason Todd from his apparent death created complications that went far beyond the simple joy of discovering that a lost friend and brother-in-arms had somehow survived his encounter with the Joker, as his resurrection came accompanied by fundamental changes in his personality and methods that transformed him from a tragic victim into a dangerous wildcard whose actions threatened to undermine everything that the Robin identity was meant to represent. The knowledge that death might not be permanent for those touched by the strange forces that surrounded superheroic activities was simultaneously hopeful and terrifying in its implications. Jason's adoption of violent methods and willingness to kill criminals represented a fundamental betrayal of the values that Bruce had tried to instill in all his protégés. Yet his arguments about the ineffectiveness of traditional heroic approaches to crime fighting contained enough truth to create internal conflicts for those who had witnessed the endless cycle of capture and escape that characterized Gotham's relationship with its most dangerous criminals. The temptation to embrace more permanent solutions to persistent threats was one that every hero faced at some point. Yet crossing that line represented a transformation that could not be easily reversed or justified. The battle for the cowl that erupted in the wake of Bruce's disappearance brought together various candidates for the Batman identity in a competition that was part succession crisis and part civil war, testing not only their individual qualifications for the role, but also their understanding of what Batman represented and their commitment to preserving his legacy rather than simply claiming his power and authority. The crisis revealed the extent to which the Batman identity had become larger than any individual, while also demonstrating the importance of choosing successors based on character and principle rather than mere capability or ambition. Dick's initial reluctance to claim the Batman mantle was rooted not in lack of confidence or ability, but in his understanding of the enormous responsibility that came with the role, and his concern that accepting it might represent a betrayal of his own identity and the independent path he had worked so hard to establish as Nightwing. The decision was further complicated by his awareness that Bruce had never explicitly designated him as his heir. Despite their reconciliation and renewed mutual respect, creating uncertainty about whether assuming the role would honor his mentor's wishes or violate them. The escalating violence and chaos that resulted from the power vacuum left by Batman's absence eventually overcame Dick's reservations and forced him to acknowledge that his personal preferences were less important than the needs of Gotham's citizens and the preservation of the principles that Batman had always represented. The recognition that he was indeed the best qualified candidate for the role came not from arrogance, but from realistic assessment of the alternatives and their likely consequences for public safety and the future of heroic idealism. The decision to accept Damian Wayne as his Robin created additional complexities that tested Dick's leadership abilities and patience in ways that his previous partnerships had not prepared him for. As Bruce's biological son brought to the role not only exceptional physical capabilities, but also attitudes and methods that had been shaped by his upbringing among the League of Assassins, rather than the values and traditions that had guided previous holders of the Robin identity. The challenge of reforming and redirecting someone whose instincts ran toward lethal force required diplomatic skills and psychological insight that went far beyond conventional crime fighting or team leadership. The relationship that developed between Dick and Damian represented a complete reversal of traditional Batman-Robin dynamics, with the older partner serving more as a restraining and civilizing influence upon the younger, rather than providing training and guidance to someone eager to learn heroic methods and values. The constant vigilance required to prevent Damian from killing criminals or civilians who frustrated him created additional stress and responsibility that made Dick's tenure as Batman more challenging than Bruce's had ever been, yet also provided opportunities for both characters to grow and develop in ways that their previous relationships had not allowed. The psychological adjustment required for Dick to function effectively as Batman while maintaining his essential personality and moral convictions created internal tensions that were never fully resolved during his time in the role, as the identity's emphasis on intimidation and psychological warfare conflicted with his naturally optimistic and collaborative approach to problem solving. The success he achieved in adapting his methods to the requirements of the Batman identity demonstrated his flexibility and professional competence, while also highlighting the personal costs of subordinating individual characteristics to institutional demands. The public response to Dick's performance as Batman was generally positive, though careful observers noted subtle differences in style and approach that suggested either character development in the established hero or replacement by someone with different training and personality traits. The speculation about Batman's true identity was nothing new in Gotham, yet the changes in behavior and methodology created additional questions that required careful management to protect the secret identities of everyone involved in the deception. Bruce's eventual return from his presumed death created both relief and complications for Dick and everyone else who had worked to preserve his legacy during his absence, as the joy of reunion was tempered by questions about succession, authority, and the future roles that various individuals would play in Gotham's heroic community. The transition period required delicate negotiations and careful planning to ensure continuity of operations. while also accommodating everyone's needs and preferences for their continued service. The formation of Batman Incorporated represented Bruce's recognition that the challenges facing modern society required heroic responses that went beyond individual action to encompass coordinated international efforts that could address threats on a global scale, while also preserving the local focus and community connections that had always been essential elements of effective heroism. The concept acknowledged that the Batman identity had become a symbol powerful enough to inspire and coordinate multiple individuals while maintaining the core values and methods that had made it effective. Dick's role in Batman Incorporated provided him with opportunities to utilize his leadership experience and international connections, while also maintaining his independence and individual identity as Nightwing, creating a balance between institutional affiliation and personal autonomy that satisfied his need for both belonging and self-determination. The position recognized his contributions to the Batman legacy, while also allowing him to pursue his own vision of heroic service and community protection. The global scope of Batman Incorporated's mission exposed Dick to challenges and threats that went far beyond the urban crime fighting that had previously defined his career, requiring him to develop new skills and perspectives that reflected the increasingly international nature of both criminal enterprises and heroic responses to them. The experience broadened his understanding of justice and cultural differences, while also reinforcing his commitment to universal human rights and the protection of innocent life regardless of nationality or political circumstances. The collaborative nature of the Batman Incorporated project provided Dick with opportunities to work alongside heroes from diverse backgrounds and traditions, creating learning experiences that enriched his understanding of different approaches to crime fighting, while also allowing him to share his own knowledge and experience with individuals who faced similar challenges in their own communities. The mutual exchange of ideas and techniques strengthened the entire organization, while also fostering personal relationships that would endure beyond any specific institutional arrangements. The legacy of Dick's second tenure as Batman extended far beyond his individual accomplishments to encompass the precedent he had established for heroic succession and the preservation of institutional values during periods of crisis and transition, demonstrating that effective leadership could transcend individual personalities while also adapting to changing circumstances and emerging threats. His success in maintaining the Batman identity's effectiveness, while also nurturing the development of a new Robin, proved that the heroic traditions he had helped to create were strong enough to survive and evolve across generations of practitioners and changing social conditions. The seismic shifts that accompanied DC Comics' ambitious New 52 initiative in 2011 created ripple effects that extended far beyond simple cosmetic changes to costumes and continuity, fundamentally altering the established relationships and historical foundations that had defined the DC universe for decades, while forcing beloved characters to navigate entirely new versions of their own origin stories and personal connections. For Dick Grayson, whose identity had been so thoroughly intertwined with the complex web of relationships surrounding the Batman family and the broader heroic community, these changes represented both liberation from accumulated continuity baggage and the painful necessity of rediscovering who he was in a universe where many of his most cherished memories and formative experiences had been erased or dramatically modified. The return to his primary identity as Nightwing rather than Batman marked a significant psychological adjustment that required Dick to reconnect with aspects of his personality and methodology that had been necessarily suppressed during his tenure wearing the Dark Knight's cowl. Yet the process was complicated by the knowledge that his previous experiences as the second Batman had fundamentally changed his understanding of leadership, responsibility, and the weight of symbolic authority that could never be entirely set aside or forgotten. The red and black costume that he adopted during this period represented more than mere aesthetic choice, serving as visual acknowledgement that this version of Nightwing had been shaped by experiences and challenges that differentiated him from the more innocent and optimistic hero he had been before taking on the mantle of Gotham's protector. The Court of Owls storyline that emerged as one of the New 52's most compelling and psychologically complex narratives provided Dick with revelations about his family history and personal destiny that challenged every assumption he had made about his own agency and the random nature of the tragedy that had claimed his parents and set him on the path toward heroism. The discovery that the Graysons had been intended to serve the court as Talons, elite assassins whose existence was dedicated to enforcing the will of Gotham's secret rulers, transformed his understanding of his family legacy from one of innocent entertainment and athletic achievement to something far more sinister and predetermined. The ancient conspiracy that had shaped Gotham's history for centuries represented a form of institutional evil that operated through patience, subtlety, and the careful manipulation of events across generations, rather than the crude violence and obvious corruption that characterized most criminal organizations that Dick had previously encountered in his heroic career. The court's ability to remain hidden and influential for so long demonstrated levels of planning and coordination that made them uniquely dangerous enemies whose defeat would require more than simple applications of heroic force or detective work. The revelation that Dick's great-grandfather had been intended to join the court's ranks as a Talon created psychological conflicts that went to the heart of his identity and sense of personal autonomy, forcing him to confront questions about fate, free will, and the extent to which his heroic career might have been influenced by genetic predispositions and family obligations that he had never consciously chosen to accept or reject. The knowledge that his bloodline had been marked for service to the court raised disturbing possibilities about whether his acrobatic abilities and natural aptitude for combat were gifts or curses, inherited from ancestors who had used similar talents for very different purposes. The physical evidence of this heritage was discovered in the most invasive and disturbing way possible, when Bruce's investigation into the court's influence revealed the existence of a false tooth that had been implanted in ablasive and disturbing way possible. Dick's mouth during his childhood, a dental modification that bore the mark of the Talon and served as both identifier and potential tracking device that could have been activated at any time to bring him under the court's control. The violation of bodily autonomy that this discovery represented was compounded by the realization that he had been carrying this mark of servitude for years without any awareness of its presence or significance. Bruce's decision to physically extract this evidence through violence rather than explanation created additional trauma that complicated Dick's ability to process the revelations about his family history and the court's intentions for his future, as the sudden pain and shock of the blow that knocked out his tooth was accompanied by the devastating realization that even his most trusted relationships could be compromised by deception and withholding of crucial information. The method of revelation suggested either panic on Bruce's part or a fundamental misunderstanding of how such sensitive information should be communicated to someone whose entire sense of identity was being challenged. Dick's response to these revelations demonstrated the strength of character and moral certainty that had been developed through years of heroic service and ethical guidance, as he rejected the deterministic implications of his heritage with a clarity and firmness that affirmed his commitment to chosen values over inherited obligations. His declaration that his destiny was not determined by his bloodline or the intentions of secret societies represented a fundamental affirmation of human agency, and the power of conscious choice to overcome even the most carefully laid plans and ancient traditions. The psychological resilience that allowed Dick to maintain his heroic identity despite learning that his family had been intended to serve as instruments of oppression and violence demonstrated the effectiveness of the moral education he had received from Bruce and Alfred, as well as his own natural inclination toward justice and protection of innocent life that transcended genetic predisposition or cultural programming. The strength of his rejection of the court's claims upon him served as proof that nurture could indeed triumph over nature when supported by consistent ethical guidance and positive role models. The Court of Owl's response to Dick's refusal to accept his predetermined role as a Talon involved escalating attempts at coercion and manipulation that tested both his physical capabilities and his psychological defenses against organized campaigns of intimidation and violence designed to break his will and force compliance with their ancient expectations. The sophistication of their methods and the depth of their resources demonstrated that this was an enemy unlike any he had previously faced, one whose patience and planning capabilities made them uniquely dangerous to heroes who relied on conventional approaches to crime fighting. The Forever Evil storyline that followed represented perhaps the darkest period in Dick's heroic career, as the invasion of Earth by the crime syndicate from Earth 3 created circumstances that threatened not only his life, but also the secret identity protections that had allowed him to maintain relationships and connections outside his costumed persona. The parallel universe villains, who served as twisted reflections of the Justice League, possessed knowledge and capabilities that made them uniquely qualified to exploit the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of their heroic counterparts, while also demonstrating the potential for corruption that existed within even the most noble individuals under different circumstances. The public revelation of Dick's secret identity represented a catastrophic breach of security that endangered not only him, but everyone who had ever been associated with his civilian persona, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond immediate physical danger to encompass the destruction of relationships and social connections that had provided emotional support and psychological grounding throughout his heroic career. The loss of privacy and the ability to maintain separate aspects of his identity created pressures and vulnerabilities that no amount of physical training or tactical preparation could adequately address. The torture device known as the murder machine into which the crime syndicate placed Dick represented both immediate physical threat and symbolic demonstration of their contempt for heroic values and the sanctity of human life, as the mechanism was designed not merely to kill, but to do so in a manner that would maximize suffering and psychological impact upon those forced to witness the execution. The machine's construction and operation suggested a level of sadistic creativity that went beyond simple criminal violence to encompass genuine evil that took pleasure in the destruction of hope and the corruption of innocence. The impossible choice that Batman and Lex Luthor faced in attempting to rescue Dick from the murder machine created moral dilemmas that tested the limits of utilitarian thinking and the willingness to sacrifice individual lives in service of greater goods, as the only method of extraction required stopping his heart and essentially killing him temporarily in order to remove him safely from the device before attempting resurrection through emergency medical procedures. The risk that such extreme measures might fail or cause permanent damage made the decision particularly agonizing for those who cared about him personally, rather than viewing him merely as a tactical asset or symbolic figure. The clinical death that Dick experienced during his extraction from the murder machine provided him with perspectives on mortality and the nature of consciousness that few living beings ever encountered, creating philosophical and spiritual insights that would influence his approach to heroism and his understanding of what it meant to risk one's life in service of others who might never fully appreciate the sacrifices being made on their behalf. The temporary separation of consciousness from physical form offered glimpses of possibilities and realities that transcended normal human experience, while also reinforcing his appreciation for the precious and fragile nature of life itself. The successful resuscitation that brought Dick back to life was accomplished through a combination of advanced medical technology and desperate determination on the part of those who refused to accept that death could claim someone whose times contributions to the cause of justice had been so significant, and whose potential for future service remained so great. Yet the process left him fundamentally changed in ways that would require time and careful observation to fully understand and address. The knowledge that he had died and been restored to life created psychological complexities that challenged conventional understanding of identity and continuity of consciousness. The decision to allow the world to continue believing that Dick Grayson had died in the crime syndicate attack was motivated by practical security considerations that recognized the impossibility of restoring his secret identity. Protections once they had been so thoroughly compromised, yet the psychological cost of this deception was enormous for someone whose entire sense of self had been built around honest relationships and authentic connections with others. The necessity of abandoning his civilian identity and all the relationships it encompassed represented a form of death that was in some ways more traumatic than the physical cessation of life he had temporarily experienced. The creation of a new identity as Agent 37 provided Dick with opportunities to apply his skills and experience in entirely new contexts, while also forcing him to develop capabilities and perspectives that his previous heroic career had not required. Yet the transition from costumed hero to secret agent involved fundamental changes in methodology and moral framework that challenged many of his basic assumptions about justice, truth, and the appropriate methods for protecting innocent life and defeating those who threatened it. The spiral organization that recruited Dick represented a form of heroic institution that operated according to principles and methods that differed significantly from the transparent idealism that had characterized his previous affiliations, requiring him to navigate moral ambiguities and ethical compromises that tested his ability to maintain his core values, while also accomplishing missions that served greater goods through sometimes questionable means. The tension between effectiveness and principle created ongoing internal conflicts that required constant vigilance and self-examination to resolve. Helena Bertinelli's role as his partner and handler during his tenure with Spiral provided Dick with professional relationships that were built on mutual competence and shared objectives rather than the personal bonds and emotional connections that had defined his previous partnerships, creating opportunities for growth and development that were both liberating and isolating in their emphasis on professional effectiveness over personal fulfillment. The partnership tested his ability to work effectively with someone whose background and methods differed significantly from his own, while maintaining the collaborative spirit that had always been essential to his success as a hero. The absence of his traditional costume and heroic identity during this period forced Dick to rely more heavily on his intelligence, training, and natural charisma, rather than the symbolic authority and intimidation factors that had been available to him as Nightwing, creating opportunities to develop aspects of his personality and capabilities that had been overshadowed by his more obvious physical and acrobatic abilities. The experience of operating without the protection and recognition that came with an established heroic identity provided valuable insights into the nature of heroism and the sources of genuine authority and influence. The international scope of Spiral's operations exposed Dick to global perspectives on justice and security that broadened his understanding of the challenges facing modern society, while also revealing the interconnected nature of, quote, immersive threats that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, requiring responses that were both more sophisticated and more culturally sensitive than the straightforward approaches that had characterized his previous crime-fighting activities. The experience prepared him for future leadership roles that would require understanding of international relations and diplomatic considerations, as well as tactical and strategic thinking. The moral complexities of intelligence work created ongoing challenges for someone whose heroic career had been built on relatively clear distinctions between right and wrong, as the necessities of maintaining cover identities and gathering information sometimes required deception, manipulation, and cooperation with individuals whose motivations and methods were questionable, even when their ultimate objectives aligned with heroic goals. The tension between means and ends that characterized intelligence operations forced Dick to develop more nuanced ethical frameworks than his previous black-and-white approach to justice had required. The temporary nature of his role as Agent 37 was always understood by all parties involved, yet the experience provided him with skills, perspectives, and relationships that would continue to influence his approach to heroism long after his return to more traditional costumed crime fighting, demonstrating the value of diverse experiences and the importance of remaining open to growth and change, even when such evolution required temporary abandonment of familiar identities and comfortable assumptions about proper methods and appropriate boundaries. The threat against Damian Wayne that ultimately forced Dick's return to his Nightwing identity represented the kind of personal stakes and emotional urgency that transcended professional obligations and strategic considerations, demonstrating that beneath all the adaptations and modifications that circumstances had imposed upon his identity and methods, his fundamental commitment to protecting those he loved remained unchanged and uncompromised by any amount of training or institutional pressure. The willingness to abandon his cover and compromise his mission for the sake of family loyalty affirmed the primacy of personal relationships and emotional bonds over abstract principles and organizational objectives in his moral hierarchy. The orchestrated threat that emerged from the shadows of Gotham's most ancient and persistent conspiracy represented not merely another criminal scheme to be thwarted through conventional heroic intervention, but a carefully calculated manipulation designed to exploit the deepest bonds of loyalty and affection that connected Dick Grayson to the extended family he had found within the Wayne household and the broader community of heroes who had shaped his development from orphaned circus performer into one of the world's most capable and respected champions of justice. The Court of Owl's decision to target Damian Wayne with a bomb implanted within his brain demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and their willingness to transform innocent children into weapons against those who opposed their centuries-old dominion over Gotham's political and economic structures. The precision with which this threat was constructed and delivered left no doubt that the court had studied Dick's personality and moral convictions with scientific thoroughness, identifying his protective instincts toward younger heroes and family members as the most reliable lever through which his behavior could be controlled and directed toward their purposes rather than his own chosen mission of protecting innocent life and preserving justice. The ultimatum that accompanied their revelation of Damian's perilous situation was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Return to active service as a Talon in their organization, or watch as the explosive device claimed the life of Bruce's biological son and Dick's adopted younger brother in a manner that would be both agonizing and irreversible. The psychological impact of this forced choice created internal conflicts that went far beyond simple tactical considerations about risk assessment and acceptable casualties, forcing Dick to confront fundamental questions about the nature of heroism and the extent to which individual autonomy could be sacrificed in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The knowledge that accepting the court's terms would essentially enslave him to an organization whose methods and objectives violated everything he believed about justice and human dignity created a moral crisis that no amount of training or previous experience had adequately prepared him to resolve. The timeline imposed by the court's ultimatum prevented careful planning or the development of alternative strategies that might have offered escape from their trap without requiring submission to their authority, demonstrating their understanding that heroes like Dick were most vulnerable when forced to make crucial decisions under extreme time pressure without adequate information or resources. The ticking clock that accompanied their threat served both practical and psychological purposes, creating stress that impaired judgment while also preventing the kind of collaborative problem-solving that had enabled Dick to overcome seemingly impossible challenges throughout his heroic career. The decision to accept the court's terms was made not from cowardice or despair, but from a calculated assessment that temporary compliance might provide opportunities to gather intelligence about their operations and capabilities, while also keeping Damien alive long enough for more permanent solutions to be developed and implemented. The choice represented a strategic retreat rather than genuine surrender, though the distinction provided little comfort when measured against the immediate necessity of assuming an identity and role that violated every principle that had guided his development as a hero and as a human being. The psychological preparation required for Dick to function effectively as a Talon while maintaining his essential moral identity created cognitive dissonance that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed framework of beliefs and values that had sustained him through years of dangerous and traumatic experiences. The necessity of appearing to embrace methods and objectives that he found repugnant while secretly working to undermine them from within required forms of compartmentalization and deception that challenged his commitment to honesty and authentic relationships with others. The training regimen imposed by the court to prepare him for his role as their agent involved not only physical conditioning and combat instruction, but also psychological indoctrination, designed to erode his individual identity and replace it with absolute loyalty to the organization and its blonde leadership, creating ongoing battles for control of his own mind and moral compass that required constant vigilance and resistance. The techniques employed were sophisticated combinations of traditional brainwashing methods with cutting-edge neuroscience and pharmaceutical intervention that attacked both conscious decision-making processes and subconscious emotional responses. The partnership with Raptor that the court arranged to support Dick's missions provided him with a collaborator whose methods and moral framework differed dramatically from those of any previous ally, creating ongoing tensions and conflicts that tested his ability to maintain his principles while also accomplishing objectives that served the court's agenda rather than his own vision of justice and protection of innocent life. Raptor's willingness to employ lethal force and his casual disregard for collateral damage represented everything that Dick had been trained to reject and oppose. Yet circumstances required him to work alongside this violent partner, while preventing him from crossing lines that would transform their missions from intelligence gathering into mass murder. The moral complexity of these undercover operations forced Dick to develop new frameworks for ethical decision-making that could accommodate the necessity of appearing to cooperate with evil while actually working to defeat it from within. requiring constant judgment calls about which compromises were acceptable temporary measures and which would constitute genuine betrayals of his heroic identity. The pressure of maintaining this balance, while under constant surveillance and evaluation by court operatives, created psychological stress that threatened to overwhelm even his considerable mental resilience and moral certainty. The intelligence that Dick was able to gather during his infiltration of the court's operations revealed the scope and sophistication of their influence over Gotham's political and economic systems, demonstrating that their power extended far beyond simple criminal activities to encompass systematic corruption of institutions and individuals that shaped the city's development and governance. The knowledge he acquired about their methods and resources would prove invaluable in future efforts to combat their influence. Yet, obtaining this information required him to witness and sometimes participate in activities that violated his deepest convictions about the sanctity of human life and the importance of protecting innocent people from exploitation and violence. The eventual resolution of the immediate crisis surrounding Damien's safety came through a combination of Dick's intelligence work, external intervention by other members of the Batman family, and the court's own internal conflicts and contradictions that created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with intimate knowledge of their operations and psychology. The successful extraction of the explosive device from Damien's brain required precise coordination and timing that demonstrated the effectiveness of the collaborative relationships that Dick had built throughout his heroic career, even when those relationships had been strained by the necessities of his undercover work. The transition away from his forced service as a Talon back to his chosen identity as Nightwing was neither immediate nor complete, as the psychological impact of his experiences with the court continued to influence his thoughts and emotions long after the immediate threats had been neutralized and his freedom restored. The knowledge of what he had been forced to do and witness while serving their agenda created guilt and self-doubt that required careful processing and integration with his understanding of moral responsibility and the sometimes tragic necessities of heroic work in an imperfect world. The memory loss storyline that emerged during this period reflected both the trauma of his experiences with the court and the ongoing effects of the various psychological manipulations and conditioning techniques that he had endured during his infiltration of their organization, creating temporary periods of confusion and disorientation that interfered with his ability to maintain his heroic identity and relationships. The temporary adoption of the name Rick Grayson and retirement from active crime fighting represented not cowardice, but necessary healing time that allowed his mind to process and recover from experiences that had pushed him beyond the bruising, normal limits of psychological endurance. The support provided by friends and family during his recovery period demonstrated the strength of the relationships he had built throughout his life and career as individuals who cared about him as a person, rather than merely as a heroic asset, worked patiently to help him rebuild his sense of identity and purpose, without pressuring him to resume activities for which he was not yet psychologically prepared. The patience and understanding shown by these supporters created opportunities for genuine healing rather than mere suppression of symptoms or premature return to dangerous activities. The gradual restoration of his memories and psychological equilibrium was accompanied by renewed appreciation for the value of human connections and the importance of maintaining relationships that transcended professional obligations or heroic missions, as Dick came to understand that his greatest strength lay not in his individual capabilities, but in his ability to inspire and coordinate with others who shared his commitment to justice and protection of innocent life. The experience of losing and regaining his sense of self provided insights into the nature of identity and consciousness that would influence his approach to heroism for the remainder of his career. The launch of DC's Infinite Frontier initiative in 2021 created new opportunities for Dick to establish his place in an evolving universe that honored the past, while also embracing possibilities for growth and change that reflected contemporary understanding of heroism, justice, and the complex relationships between individual responsibility and collective action. The appointment of Tom Taylor as writer and Bruno Redondo as artist for his solo series signaled editorial commitment to exploring the full potential of his character, while also acknowledging the rich history and established relationships that had made him such a beloved and influential figure in the DC universe. The return to Bloodhaven as his primary base of operations represented both a homecoming to a city where he had previously established himself as a protector and defender, and a recognition that effective heroism required deep roots in specific communities, rather than the kind of globe-trotting adventures that might provide excitement but failed to address the underlying social and economic conditions that created environments where crime and corruption could flourish. The choice to focus his efforts on a single city reflected his understanding that lasting change required sustained commitment and intimate knowledge of local conditions rather than dramatic but temporary interventions. The inheritance of Alfred Pennyworth's considerable fortune created both opportunities and responsibilities that Dick had never previously been required to navigate, as the sudden acquisition of vast financial resources provided him with unprecedented capabilities for funding heroic activities, while also creating obligations to use this wealth in ways that would honor the memory and values of the man who had been a father figure and moral guide throughout his development from traumatized orphan into confident hero and leader. The burden of managing such resources effectively while maintaining his commitment to direct action and personal involvement in crime fighting required new skills and perspectives that complemented, rather than replaced, his existing capabilities. The establishment of new charitable foundations and community support programs funded by Alfred's bequest allowed Dick to address root causes of crime and social dysfunction rather than merely responding to their symptoms, creating opportunities for prevention and intervention that went beyond the dramatic but limited impact of traditional costumed crime fighting. The integration of these broader social initiatives with his direct heroic activities demonstrated his evolving understanding of how individual action and systemic change could work together to create lasting improvements in the lives of ordinary citizens who deserved safety and opportunity, regardless of their economic circumstances or social connections. The romantic relationship with Barbara Gordon that developed during this period represented not merely personal happiness, but also the maturation of a partnership that combined emotional intimacy with professional collaboration, as both individuals had grown and developed into heroes whose capabilities and perspectives complemented each other in ways that enhanced their effectiveness, while also providing the kind of mutual support and understanding that sustained long-term commitment to dangerous and demanding work. Their shared history and parallel development as members of the extended Batman family created foundations for trust and communication that enabled both personal and professional success. The leadership of the modern Teen Titans that Dick assumed during this period demonstrated his continued commitment to mentoring and guiding the next generation of heroes, while also acknowledging his own growth from eager student, experienced teacher whose wisdom and judgment had been earned Through years of success and failure in confronting threats that ranged from street crime to cosmic catastrophe, his approach to team leadership reflected lessons learned from his own development and the various models of heroic collaboration he had observed and participated in throughout his career. The ongoing challenges posed by new and evolved versions of familiar threats required Dick to adapt his methods and strategies while maintaining the core principles and values that had defined his heroic identity since his first night as Robin, demonstrating that effective heroism required both consistency of purpose and flexibility of approach in response to changing circumstances and emerging dangers. The balance between tradition and innovation that characterized his mature approach to crime fighting served as a model for other heroes who struggled to maintain their effectiveness while also honoring the legacies and expectations associated with established heroic identities. The global perspective that informed Dick's current activities reflected his understanding that modern threats transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, requiring responses that combined local knowledge and community connections with international cooperation and resource sharing that could address root causes rather than merely suppressing symptoms of larger problems. His involvement in various international heroic organizations and initiatives demonstrated his commitment to building networks of mutual support and collaboration that could respond effectively to challenges that exceeded the capabilities of any individual hero or single organization. The philosophical maturity that characterized Dick's current approach to heroism encompassed recognition that perfect solutions to complex problems were rarely achievable, yet this understanding enhanced, rather than diminished, his commitment to making whatever positive difference was possible through sustained effort and principled action that honored the dignity and potential of every human life regardless of circumstances or apparent worthiness. The wisdom gained through years of experience had taught him that heroism was measured not by the magnitude of victories achieved, but by the consistency of effort applied and the integrity maintained throughout the ongoing struggle between justice and oppression, hope and despair, creation and destruction that defined the human condition. The legacy that Dick Grayson continued to build through his work as Nightwing in the modern era represented not an ending but an evolution, demonstrating that growth and change were essential elements of effective heroism, rather than betrayals of established tradition or abandonment of fundamental values that had guided previous generations of champions and protectors. His story served as proof that individuals could overcome even the most devastating losses and traumatic experiences to become forces for positive change in the world, inspiring others to pursue their own paths toward meaning and service, while also honoring the memory of those whose sacrifices had made such possibilities available to future generations. In the end, the story of Dick Grayson stands as perhaps the greatest testament to growth and transformation in the chronicles of heroism. From the heights of Haley's Circus to the shadows of Gotham City, from the eager boy who became the first Robin to the confident leader who claimed his own destiny as Nightwing, his journey reflects the eternal human capacity for evolution and renewal. He has been student and teacher, follower and leader, son and brother, showing us that true heroism lies not in the powers we possess, but in how we choose to use them in service of others. Rest now, dreamer of tomorrow's possibilities, knowing that, somewhere in the darkness, Nightwing watches over those who cannot protect themselves, carrying forward the lessons learned from tragedy and triumph alike. May your sleep be as peaceful as the nights he guards, and may your dreams soar as high as the acrobat who learned to fly without wings.